The gate to Callaway Ranch didn't have a proper sign anymore. There had been one once. Rhett's father had carved it from a thick piece of pine and hung it between two cedar posts, the letters deep and deliberate. Callaway Ranch, established 1861. The wind had taken it sometime in the autumn 2 years back, and Rhett hadn't seen any reason to replace it. What was the point of announcing a place that no one was supposed to come to? He was on the porch when the wagon appeared at the end of the trail, coming up through the dry scrub and juniper in the late afternoon heat. He didn't move right away. He sat in his chair with a mug of coffee gone cold and watched it approach the way a man watches a storm he can't quite determine the direction of, waiting to see if it would pass or if it was headed straight for him. It was a sorry-looking rig. One of the wheels had a wobble to it that he could see from 50 yards, and the horse pulling it was a gray mare that had seen better decades. There was a woman at the reins. That much was clear from a distance. And as the wagon drew closer, he could make out the shapes of children around her. 3 of them. One up front beside the woman, 2 more in the bed, sitting among what looked like bundled blankets in a trunk that had been roped down with fraying cord. Rhett set his coffee mug on the rail and stood up. He was a big man. Not in any exaggerated way, just the kind of big that came from years of actual labor, shoulders that had carried fence posts and sacks of grain, and the weight of things that couldn't be set down. He was 41, though he looked a year or 2 older since the winter. His beard had grown and uneven, and he hadn't been particularly motivated to address it. The wagon stopped about 20 feet from his porch. The woman set the brake and climbed down before he could say a word, and he noticed the way she moved, deliberate, not graceful, the movements of someone who was very tired and was refusing to let it show in any way that mattered. She smoothed her skirt with one hand, though there wasn't much smoothing to be done with a skirt that dusty. Then she looked up at him and didn't look away. She was not what he expected. He hadn't known what he expected, but not this. She was somewhere in her early 30s, with brown hair pulled back hard against her head and gray eyes that were doing quite a lot of work all at once, calculating and cautious and something else underneath that he couldn't name immediately. She wasn't beautiful in any simple way. Her nose had a slight irregularity to it that suggested it had been broken once and set by someone who wasn't a doctor. Her jaw was set firm. There were shadows under her eyes that weren't from the road. She wasn't pretty. She was something more complicated than pretty. "I'm looking for Mr. Callaway," she said. Her voice was level. "Rhett Callaway. I was told in town he sometimes takes on help." "Who told you that?" She paused, just briefly. "A woman at the dry goods store. Mrs. Hale." Rhett knew Agnes Hale. Of course he did. Agnes Hale, who had decided several years ago that Rhett Callaway's solitude was her personal project, and who had apparently now escalated to sending strangers to his doorstep. "Agnes Hale," he said, in a tone that didn't give much away. "She said you had a working ranch and that you'd lost your housekeeper last spring." The woman's eyes moved briefly to the porch, the house behind him, and back to his face. She wasn't wrong about the state of things. It was a bold thing to say to a man whose property you were standing on uninvited. He almost said so. Instead, he looked past her at the wagon and the children. The one who had ridden up front beside her was a girl, he could see now, maybe 12 or 13, with her mother's same gray eyes and her mother's same expression of careful watchfulness. In the back, a boy of about 10 sat with his legs dangling over the edge, and a smaller child. Another boy, he thought, though it was hard to tell under the brim of a hat 2 sizes too large, was curled up against a bundle of blankets, asleep or close to it. "How old's the youngest?" he asked. 6, she said. "He's not sick, if that's what you're wondering. He's just tired." "I wasn't wondering that." "Most people wonder that," she said. "When a child that age is asleep at this hour, people wonder." Rhett looked back at her. "What's your name?" "Eleanor Pierce." "Where are you coming from, Mrs. Pierce?" Another brief pause. Barely there, but he caught it. "Most recently from Cimarron. Before that, Santa Fe." "Most recently," he repeated. "That's what I said." He should have sent her on. He knew that in the part of his brain that handled practical matters, the part that was still functioning more or less correctly. He had no housekeeper. That was true. He had a ranch that was running at about 60% of what it should be because he was one man managing what had once been a 2-person operation, and he had stopped caring enough about the difference to hire help. He didn't want people on his property. He didn't want to hear voices in his house. He didn't want the specific particular pain of watching a family exist in the rooms where his own family had existed. He looked at the sleeping 6-year-old in the wagon bed. "The children work?" he asked. Eleanor Pierce's chin came up a fraction of an inch. "My children earn their keep everywhere they go." "That's not what I asked." "Yes," she said, with a controlled evenness that told him the question had stung, but she wasn't going to show it. "They work. Maggie, my daughter. She can cook and she knows her way around a kitchen. Thomas does well with animals. Even Charlie helps where he can. What can you do?" "I can do most things a ranch needs," she said. "Garden, preserve, clean, mend, cook. I know enough about livestock to be useful and enough about what I don't know to stay out of the way. I'm not delicate and I'm not slow and I don't complain about the work." She stopped. "I need somewhere to stay, Mr. Calloway. My children need somewhere to stay. I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering fair labor for fair shelter and whatever wage you think is honest." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "I've only got one room I can offer," he said finally. "It's small. You'd all be in it. We've shared smaller. I'm not easy to work for." "I'm not easy to work with," she said. "We can be difficult together." He almost smiled. He didn't, but it was close. "Bring the wagon around back," he said. "I'll show you the room." The room was, as promised, small. It was off the back of the kitchen, originally built as a storage room and later used as a housekeeper's quarters when they'd had one. There were 2 narrow beds and a rope cot that had seen better years, a small chest of drawers missing one handle, and a window that looked out at the tool shed. Eleanor stood in the doorway and took it in without comment. "It's clean," she said, which was the most generous thing she could have honestly said about it, and she said it without sarcasm. "I swept it out last month," Rhett said. This was true, though the standard for swept had been fairly minimal. "It'll do." She turned back to where Maggie was standing in the kitchen doorway with Charlie on her hip, the boy now awake and looking at everything with the enormous-eyed wariness of a child who had learned that new places sometimes meant trouble. Thomas stood beside his sister, hat in his hands. "Come on," Eleanor said to them. "Bring in the trunk first." Thomas looked at Rhett briefly, a quick, assessing look that reminded Rhett of his mother, and then went to do what he was told. Rhett left them to settle in. He went out to see to the gray mare, which turned out to be in worse shape than he'd thought. Her hooves needed work. She was probably 10 pounds underweight, and she'd been ridden harder than she should have been on the road in from Cimarron. He watered her and fed her from his own stock and found a spot for her in the far paddock, away from his 2 horses, in case she was carrying anything she hadn't shown yet. When he came back in for supper, the kitchen smelled different. Not bad different, just different. Eleanor had found the dried beans and the salt pork, and there was a pot going on the stove, and she'd cut the bread he'd left out on the counter into proper slices and arranged them without making a production of it. Maggie was setting the table. Charlie was sitting on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon, apparently conducting some private investigation of its properties. Thomas was nowhere in sight. "Where's the boy?" Rhett asked. "Checking on the horses," Eleanor said, without turning from the stove. "He asked first. I told him it was all right." "Was it?" Rhett looked out the window toward the barn. He could see a slight figure moving near the paddock fence. "It's fine," he said. He sat at the table which he hadn't eaten at in, he tried to calculate, 4 months, maybe 5. He'd been taking most meals at the kitchen counter or outside on the porch when the weather allowed. The table was for more than one person, and he'd stopped seeing the point of it. Supper was simple and it was good. Eleanor didn't talk much during it, but she asked him 2 practical questions: where the well was, and whether the cook stove had any particular habits she needed to know about, and she listened carefully to the answers. Maggie was quiet in the way of children who had been taught that quiet was safer. Thomas ate with the contained urgency of a boy who'd been genuinely hungry and was trying not to show how much. Charlie fell half asleep over his bowl, and Eleanor moved him to her lap without interrupting her own eating, holding him against her with one arm and managing her spoon with the other. After, when the children were in their room, Rhett sat on the porch with what was left of the coffee and tried to figure out what he had just done. He told himself for 2 years that he didn't want this. Voices in the house, people moving through rooms where he didn't want anyone moving, the small domestic machinery of a family running, the sounds of it, the smell of it. He told himself very firmly and very often that the quiet was what he needed. Sitting there in the evening with light coming through the kitchen window and the distant sound of the three children getting settled, Maggie's voice, low and steady, Charlie asking something, Thomas answering. Rhett Calloway acknowledged, with a discomfort he didn't examine too closely, that the quiet he'd been keeping for 2 years was not the same thing as peace. But her name had been Clara. She had died in February, 3 years back, from a fever that had gone into her lungs and simply refused to leave. She had been 38 years old, and she had laughed easily and complained rarely, and she had understood the ranch the way some people understood horses. Not because she'd studied it, but because it was part of how she thought. She had planted the kitchen garden herself, every spring, in a specific order she'd never written down because she'd never expected to not be there to remember it. The garden had gone in the weeds in 2 seasons. Rhett had not replanted it. He did not think about Clara every day anymore. That was the thing about grief that no one told you honestly. It didn't stay at full volume. It got quieter, not because it was getting smaller, but because you got more used to the noise of it. And then you started to mistake the familiarity for healing, which was not the same thing at all. He thought about her that night, lying on his side in the big bed that was too big and too quiet, listening to the small sounds of his house being occupied again. He thought about her the way he sometimes did, not with active sorrow, but with a low, persistent ache that he had largely stopped noticing until something pressed on it. A family sleeping in the back room of his house pressed on it. He went to sleep eventually. In the morning, he woke to the sound of someone already in the kitchen. Eleanor Pierce had been up before him. She had, it emerged, also been up before dawn, and had already stoked the stove, started the coffee, and was in the process of examining his root cellar situation with an expression that mixed professional concern with something closer to resigned dismay. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she looked up without apology. "You're low on most things," she said. "Not critically, but heading that way. When's the last time you made a supply run?" Rhett thought about it. End of March. It was mid-May. "Right," she said, making the single word do a lot of work. "I'll need a list from you of what the ranch absolutely requires, and I'll make a list of what the household needs. We can consolidate when we go to town." He noticed she said "we" without seeming to notice she'd said it. "I usually go alone," he said. "That's fine." She went back to her assessment of the cellar. "But 2 people make a faster trip, and I need to know where the supplier relationships are so I can manage them directly when you're busy." He stood in his kitchen doorway and looked at this woman who had arrived the previous evening with a wobble-wheeled wagon and 3 children and nothing much else, and who was now, apparently, reorganizing his supply chain before breakfast. "You've run a house before," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've run several," she said, "in a number of situations." She picked up a jar of something, examined it, set it back. "This is what I know how to do, Mr. Calloway. I'm not going to pretend to know cattle or land the way you do, but this—" She gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the cellar, the domestic infrastructure of the place. "This I know." Thomas appeared at the back door, mud already on his boots. "There's a loose board on the west fence," he said to Rhett, without preamble. "Third post from the corner. The nails are pulling out." Rhett looked at him for a moment. "You were out there at dawn?" "Before," Thomas said, with the mild delivery of someone for whom before dawn was not a remarkable time to be awake. "I wanted to see how the gray was settling in. She's eating good. I checked the fence while I was out there." He paused. "I didn't do anything to it. I know it's not my fence to fix." "It's fine," Rhett said. "I'll look at it this morning." "I can help if you want," Thomas said. "I'm good with a hammer." Rhett looked at Eleanor, who was watching this exchange with her arms crossed and an expression of deliberate neutrality that told him this was Thomas's own initiative, not hers. "All right," Rhett said. After breakfast. That was how it started. Not with any dramatic decision or spoken agreement, but with fence posts and a supply list and coffee drunk while standing up because that was faster, the kind of small dailiness that accumulated without being noticed until it was already load-bearing. The fence took most of the morning. Thomas worked with the unself-conscious competence of a boy who had learned to be useful very young, handing tools before Rhett asked for them, holding things steady without being told to, working without chatter. He was small for 10, but not fragile. There was a wiry endurance to him that Rhett recognized as the kind built by genuine necessity rather than character-building exercises. They didn't talk much. What conversation there was came in fragments. "You know ranching?" Rhett asked at one point. Thomas shrugged, a careful sort of shrug. "Bits of it. We lived near a ranch for a while. I helped out some." "Where was that?" "Tucson." A pause. "Before Santa Fe." Rhett didn't push. He noticed that Thomas had a way of placing things geographically rather than chronologically, as if the passage of time was less reliable to him than the passage of places. He filed that observation away somewhere and didn't examine it further. By noon, the fence was solid. They walked back to the house, and Thomas washed up at the pump and went inside with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who knew exactly what was expected of him and had no interest in waiting to be asked to do it. Maggie had made lunch. She was 12, it turned out, and she cooked with the focused seriousness of someone who had been doing it long enough to have moved past nervousness into competence. It was nothing fancy. Sliced bread, cold beans, a few slices of ham, but it was put together thoughtfully, portions calculated with a precision that Rhett suspected wasn't accidental. Charlie sat beside Eleanor and ate with both hands, occasionally pausing to tell his mother things in a rapid murmur that seemed to cover a wide range of topics. He had a gap in his front teeth and dark hair that stuck up at the back, regardless of what was done to it, and he had apparently spent his morning conducting a thorough investigation of the barn, the tool shed, and the space under the porch. "He's not destructive," Eleanor said, noticing Rhett watching Charlie's recitation. "He's curious. There's a difference." "I know the difference," Rhett said. He said it in a tone that closed the subject, and Eleanor let it close. That, he noted, was something. She had a sense of which things to press and which to leave alone. Not every person had that. In the second week, Eleanor started on the kitchen garden. She didn't ask about it. She found the tools in the shed. She assessed the soil. She asked Thomas to help her clear the weeds, and she started turning the earth in the long beds that ran along the south wall of the house. When Rhett came around the side of the house and found her on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up, pulling out the root systems of weeds that had been growing unchallenged for 2 years, he stopped. She looked up. "I should have asked," she said. "I'm sorry. I can stop." Rhett looked at the garden beds, at what they had been. Clara's domain, her particular investment, the thing she had complained about good-naturedly in dry years and been openly proud of in wet ones. "No," he said after a moment. "It needs doing." "I don't know what she had planted," Eleanor said carefully. She'd been in town. Agnes Hale had a mouth the size of a barn door. Of course she knew about Clara. "I thought I'd start with what makes sense for the season and see how the soil responds." "She had tomatoes along the west end," Rhett said. "Beans in the middle, squash near the fence." Eleanor nodded, taking that information in without comment on the fact that he'd given it. "That makes sense for the light," she said. He stood there another moment, then went back to what he'd been doing. He came back twice that afternoon, for reasons he told himself were practical. And both times Eleanor was still at it, working her way systematically through the beds with the methodical patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. In town the following Saturday, the reception was what Rhett had expected and had been dreading. He had been in New Mexican Springs long enough and lived quietly enough that his business was everyone's business in the specific way of small frontier towns, and the arrival of a widow woman and 3 children at his ranch had covered the usual distance in the usual time. By the time he tied up at the general store, at least 4 people had managed to find reasons to be approximately nearby. Agnes Hale did not bother with approximately nearby. Agnes Hale met him on the boardwalk with the directness that was her defining characteristic. "I see she found you," Agnes said. "You sent her," Rhett said. "I suggested the possibility," Agnes said, with the dignity of a woman who understood that there were differences. "She needed work, and you needed—" "Thank you, Agnes. Someone to remind you that you still live in a house and not a—" "Thank you, Agnes." Agnes closed her mouth, narrowed her eyes in a way that conveyed she had more to say and intended to say it at a later time, and stepped aside. Eleanor handled the supply run with the efficiency of someone who had done this in many towns. She knew how to speak to suppliers, knew what questions to ask about quality and price, knew how to accept what was fair, and how to politely and firmly decline what wasn't. She made two people laugh in the dry goods store. She listened carefully when the blacksmith told her about a place in town that sometimes had seeds at a better price. Rhett watched her work the street the way she worked the kitchen, knowledgeably, without waste motion, with a precise awareness of what things cost and what they were worth. What he also noticed, though he did not mention it, was the way she watched the street. There was a pattern to it, periodic, almost mechanical. She would be talking to someone, and her eyes would track to the near end of the main road, pause, return. Track to the far end, pause, return. She did it with the practiced casualness of someone who had been doing it so long it had stopped being conscious. She was looking for someone, or looking to make sure someone wasn't there. He filed that away with the other things he was filing away and didn't ask about it. Charlie decided that Rhett was interesting somewhere around the third week. It started with the boy following him out to the barn one morning, at a careful distance, testing whether this would be permitted. And then, when it wasn't stopped, gradually closing that distance over the course of about an hour until he was standing directly at Rhett's elbow, watching him work on a piece of harness with an expression of the most intense intellectual focus. "What's that part called?" Charlie asked. "Cheek piece," Rhett said. "What's it do?" "Holds the bit in the right position in the horse's mouth." "Why do horses need bits?" "So you can tell them which way to go." "Why can't you just tell them with words?" Rhett looked down at him. "You can sometimes, if you know the horse well enough and it knows you." Charlie absorbed this. "Do your horses know you?" "They do." "Does the gray know my mom?" "Getting there," Rhett said. Charlie nodded seriously, apparently satisfied. He stayed for another 20 minutes, asking questions at the rate of approximately one per minute, with the unflagging curiosity of a small person who had decided this was a productive use of his time, and then wandered off to investigate something else. He came back the next morning, and the one after that. Rhett did not say anything about this to Eleanor. He told himself it was because there was nothing necessary to say. He told himself the same thing 3 days later when he found himself showing the boy how to properly coil a rope. And 2 days after that when Charlie informed him very solemnly that he had named the gray mare Silver Button, and he hoped that was all right. "It's your mother's horse," Rhett said. "But I'm the one who named her," Charlie said, which settled the matter to his satisfaction. At the end of the first month, Rhett took an evening inventory of what his ranch looked like and found, to some discomfort, that it looked better. The kitchen garden was laid out and beginning to show growth. The supply situation was addressed and organized in a way he wouldn't have thought to do himself. The interior of the house had been cleaned with a thoroughness that had apparently been required. He found this out primarily because several things that had been in their wrong places for so long he'd stopped noticing were now in right places, and it kept catching his eye. The household operated on a rhythm he could feel but hadn't established, a current that ran through the place and moved the day forward without requiring him to be the one pushing it. The children were becoming known quantities. Thomas was reliable and observant and did not make the same mistake twice. Maggie had a sense of humor she kept mostly contained, but which came out sideways when she thought she wasn't being watched, quick and dry and briefly visible before she tucked it back behind the careful expression. Charlie was Charlie, relentless and curious and somehow impossible to be annoyed by for more than about 30 seconds. And Eleanor Pierce organized, maintained, and moved through his house like a woman who had been doing this specific thing in one form or another her entire life. He still didn't know what she was running from. He had not asked directly because something told him that asking directly would cause her to leave, and he had determined, not with any fanfare, just quietly, in the way that practical conclusions got made, that he didn't want her to leave. He didn't examine that determination. He just noted it existed. What he did examine, late on a Thursday evening when a noise outside had pulled him to the front porch, was the fact that Eleanor was already there. She was standing at the far end of the porch rail, perfectly still, looking down the empty night road the way he had seen her look at Main Street in town. That systematic scan, that practiced vigilance. She heard him come out and turned. She was not startled. She was the kind of person who didn't startle easily, which Rhett had come to understand was not a quality you were born with. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Thought I heard something," she said. "I heard it too, probably coyotes." She nodded. She didn't entirely relax, but she acknowledged the possibility. They stood there for a moment, both looking at the dark road, the stars above it very thick and clear. "You don't have to tell me anything," Rhett said. He kept his voice level. "I'm not asking." Eleanor looked at him. The moonlight showed him the careful consideration in her face before she answered. "Good," she said, with a steadiness that had something fragile at the center of it that she was not allowing to show. "Because I can't. Not yet." "All right," he said. That was all. He went back inside. She stayed on the porch for a while longer before he heard her footsteps come inside and the quiet sound of the back room door closing. Rhett lay awake for an hour, looking at the ceiling, and thought about the word yet and what it meant that she had used it. Yet meant there might be a later. Yet meant she was considering the possibility of staying long enough for a later to exist. He closed his eyes eventually. Outside, the coyotes called back and forth across the dark land, and the ranch sat quiet under the wide New Mexico sky, more alive than it had been in 3 years, holding its people close in the way that houses do when they have been, at last, given back their purpose. It was Maggie who gave him the first real piece of it. She didn't mean to. She was 12 and sharp and careful, and she gave it to him accidentally, the way careful people sometimes do when they've been carrying something for so long that it slips through in the wrong moment. They were in the barn together, Rhett checking on the horses, Maggie there for no specific reason beyond the fact that she had started coming to the barn most evenings, and had never offered an explanation, and he had never asked for one. She groomed the gray mare, Silver Button, as the horse was now apparently officially named, with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything. She used to smile more, Maggie said, out of nothing, the way children do when they've been holding a thought for a while. Rhett didn't pretend not to know who she meant. When? Before. Maggie kept brushing, her strokes long and even. When my dad was alive, she used to laugh at things. She paused. She still laughs, just different, like she's checking first. Rhett watched the girl work. How long has your father been gone? 3 years, Maggie said. He got sick. It was fast. She said it with the resigned matter-of-factness of a child who had had a long time to practice saying it. After that, we had to move. Mama said we couldn't stay where we were. Why not? The brush paused, just for a second. Couldn't afford it anymore, she said. The pause had been too brief for her to mean it as a lie exactly, more like a simplification, a story with something taken out of it. I see, Rhett said. They finished with the horses in quiet. As they were walking back to the house, Maggie said, without looking at him, "You're not as bad as I thought you'd be." "I'm not sure that's a compliment," he said. "It is," she said seriously. "I've met a lot of bad ones." She went inside. Rhett stood in the evening air for a while, the stars beginning to appear above the ridgeline, and thought about what a 12-year-old girl meant when she said she'd met a lot of bad ones and said it with that particular flatness, that particular absence of surprise. He thought about a woman who scanned the road every time she was in town, a woman who had used the word yet like a door she wasn't sure whether to open. 3 children who had learned very young how to make themselves useful and very quiet, and how to move on when staying became impossible. He didn't know what was coming. He didn't know what shape the danger took or how far behind them it was. What he knew, standing there in the gathering dark of his own land, was that whatever it was, it hadn't finished following them. And that, when it arrived, it was going to arrive here. The garden came in faster than Rhett expected. By the end of the 6th week, the tomato plants along the west end had pushed up past the stakes Eleanor had set for them, and the bean rows in the middle were thick enough to need thinning. The squash near the fence had spread in that aggressive way squash always did, claiming territory without asking. Eleanor walked the beds every morning before the heat came in, checking each plant with her hands as much as her eyes, feeling the soil between her fingers to see what it needed. Rhett had watched her do this a few times from the kitchen window before he'd stopped watching on purpose. There was something about it that sat uncomfortably in his chest. The specific way she moved through those beds, the attention she gave them, the fact that it was working. Clara had moved the same way through the same space, not identically. Eleanor was more methodical, less instinctive, where Clara had gardened the way she did most things, by some interior compass that rarely needed correcting. But the outline of it was the same. A woman taking care of something that needed taking care of. He didn't say any of this to Eleanor. He wasn't sure what he would have said even if he'd wanted to. What he did say, one morning when he found her crouched at the far end of the bean row pulling beetles off the leaves by hand and dropping them into a tin cup, was, "You could use soap water for those." Eleanor looked up. Her hair had come half loose from its pin, and there was a smear of dirt on her jaw that she apparently hadn't noticed. "I know," she said, "but the soap gets into the soil, and this many I can do by hand faster." She looked back at the leaves. "Also, it's satisfying." He almost asked what was satisfying about pulling beetles off plants in the morning heat, but he had begun to understand that Eleanor Pierce found satisfaction in the particular and the physical, in problems she could address directly, with her hands, one at a time, in the correct sequence. He suspected this had something to do with what she'd spent the last several years of her life dealing with, which was a problem of a different category entirely. "Breakfast's ready," he said instead. "I'll be in 5 minutes." It was 12 minutes, but he didn't say anything about that either. The rhythms of the ranch had rearranged themselves around the presence of 5 people in a way that was strange to Rhett, and also, he was forced to admit, not unwelcome. Thomas was up first most mornings and had taken on the early barn work with a self-sufficiency that occasionally made Rhett feel mildly outpaced by a 10-year-old. The boy had a memory for animal behavior that was better than most grown men Rhett had known. He noticed things before they became problems. A shift in a horse's movement, a change in a cow's appetite, the early signs that something was off before it declared itself openly. "He's good," Rhett said to Eleanor one evening, meaning it. "I know," she said. She said it without any particular pride, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. But her mouth softened a little in a way she probably didn't intend to show. Maggie had taken over most of the cooking by then, with Eleanor supervising less and less as the weeks proved that supervision wasn't needed. The girl cooked the way she did everything, precisely, efficiently, without waste. She had also, somewhere along the way, quietly annexed the household accounts. Rhett discovered this when he went looking for the supply ledger and found it in Maggie's handwriting, neater than his, organized in a way his hadn't been, with a running calculation of what they had against what they needed that was genuinely useful. She asked if she could do it, Eleanor said, when he showed her the ledger. "I told her to ask you." "She didn't ask me," he said. Eleanor considered this. "No, she probably decided that was faster," she said. "I'll speak to her." "Don't," Rhett said. He looked at the careful columns, the small, neat numbers. "It's better than what I had." Charlie, meanwhile, had committed fully to his self-assigned role as Rhett's shadow. The boy had an internal schedule that was opaque to everyone except himself, moving through the day on some private itinerary that seemed to involve approximately equal parts of investigation, conversation, and sitting very still near whatever Rhett happened to be doing, in the manner of a reasonably attentive apprentice. "Why does the saddle have 2 girths?" Charlie asked one afternoon, watching Rhett tack up for a fence inspection. "This one's a regular cinch. That's the flank cinch. Keeps the saddle from tipping." "Does it tip a lot?" "Without it, yes." "Has yours ever tipped with you on it?" "Once." "What happened?" "I fell off." Charlie absorbed this with the grave consideration it apparently deserved. "Did it hurt?" "Yes." "Where?" "Shoulder," Rhett said. He swung up and settled. "You going to stand there asking questions all day, or are you going to open the gate?" Charlie ran to the gate, pulled it open with both hands in considerable effort, and stood back with the air of someone who had meaningfully contributed to a significant operation. He was 6. He weighed maybe 45 pounds. He had decided that Rhett Calloway was his particular concern, and Rhett had found, without entirely understanding how, that he had more or less accepted this. It was not something he would have described to anyone. It was just something that was true. The trouble started on a Thursday in the 7th week. Rhett had ridden out to the far north pasture to check a section of fence that Thomas had flagged. The boy had seen it from a distance and noted that 2 posts looked like they were leaning wrong. He had been right, as he almost always was. Rhett spent most of the morning resetting the posts and was coming back through the east approach when he saw the 2 riders on the road below. They weren't in any hurry. They were coming in from the direction of town, moving at a walk, and they had the particular looseness of men who weren't going anywhere in particular, which in Rhett's experience meant they were going somewhere very specific and didn't want to look it. He pulled up at the ridgeline and watched them for a moment. He didn't recognize either horse. He could see that both men were armed, the glint of iron at the hip, clear enough in the afternoon light. But that wasn't unusual in New Mexico. Most men were armed. The prickling at the back of Rhett's neck was not about the guns. It was about the angle of their approach and the way they kept looking at the ridgeline themselves, checking it, the way you did when you wanted to know if you were being watched. He came down off the ridge the back way and got to the house before they did. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She read his face before he said anything, the way she did, that instant, practiced reading of what a room held before she decided how to enter it. She went still in a way that was different from her ordinary stillness. "Writers," he said, low. "2 men, coming in from town." 1 second. That was all she took. Then she said very quietly, "What do they look like?" Couldn't see their faces well, both big. One's on a roan, one's on a bay. He paused. They were watching the ridge. Eleanor set down what she was holding. Her hands were steady. Her face was doing something he hadn't seen it do before. A specific kind of tightening, a shutting down of expression that was different from her usual carefulness. This was not a woman being cautious. This was a woman managing something she had rehearsed. "Where are the children?" he asked. "Maggie's out back. Thomas went to the east pasture with Charlie." She looked past him toward the front window, then back. "Do they need to come in?" "Not yet." He held her gaze. "Eleanor, do you know who these men are?" She didn't answer immediately. That was its own kind of answer. "Maybe," she said. "I don't know. Maybe not." She pressed her lips together, then said, with a controlled quietness that was harder to hear than anger would have been, "I don't always know. They don't always use the same ones." Rhett absorbed that. The same ones. Not men she knew, men sent by someone she knew. "Go check on Maggie," he said. "Send her inside. Stay in the kitchen." "Rhett." "I'm not going to do anything foolish," he said. "I'm going to talk to 2 strangers who rode up my road. That's all." He looked at her directly. "Go." She went. He watched her move to the back door with that particular controlled speed she had, and then he went to the front porch and sat down in his chair and waited. The men rode up 4 minutes later. They stopped at a reasonable distance, respectful of the boundary, or performing its respect, which wasn't the same thing. The one on the roan was maybe 40, with a heavy jaw and the weathered look of someone who'd spent considerable time outdoors by necessity rather than choice. The one on the bay was younger and quieter, and was doing the thing that Rhett didn't like, which was watching the sides of the house rather than the man he was supposedly calling on. "Mr. Calloway?" the older one said. "Who's asking?" Rhett said. "Name's Dodd. This is Aldrich." He tipped his head toward the bay. "We're passing through the county, looking for information about a woman, widow woman, 3 children, brown hair, gray eyes. Goes by the name Pierce, or might be using a different name." He paused and then added with the precise casualness of a man who has practiced this. "She's a family matter. Kinfolk are worried about her." The younger one, Aldrich, had stopped watching the sides of the house and was now looking at Rhett's face with an attention that was a little too focused to be casual. Rhett looked at Dodd for a long moment without expression. He had a good poker face. He had cultivated it over 41 years of being a man who found it useful. "Can't help you," he said. "You haven't heard me out," Dodd said. "I've heard what you said. I can't help you. I've got a ranch to run and I don't make it my business to know about people passing through." He let a beat go by. "Where'd you ride in from?" "Town," Dodd said. "You talked to the sheriff?" A pause, barely there. "Not yet." "Huh," Rhett said in the tone of a man finding this mildly interesting. "Family matters seems like the kind of thing a sheriff's office might help with." Dodd looked at him steadily. "We'd rather keep it private if we can." "I imagine you would," Rhett said. He stood up from his chair, not aggressively, just the stand-up of a man who is done with a conversation. He was a good 2 inches taller than Dodd and wider across the shoulders, and he made no particular effort to minimize this. "Well, I'll tell you the same thing I tell anyone riding up here. This is private land and I've got work to do. You're welcome to ask in town if you haven't already." The younger one, Aldrich, looked at the house one more time. It was a deliberate look. He wanted Rhett to see it. Rhett looked back at him without changing expression. "Appreciate your time," Dodd said, in a tone that didn't appreciate anything. He turned the roan, and the younger one followed. Rhett watched them ride out. He watched them until they were off his land and turning back toward the road to town, and then he stayed on the porch for another 10 minutes after that, because there was a version of this that involved circling back through the scrub, and he wanted to be sure. They didn't circle back. He went inside. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She had done exactly as he'd asked. She was there. She was standing. Maggie was at the table with her arms folded like she'd been told to stay put and had stayed put and wanted credit for it. Both of them looked at him when he came through the door. "They're gone," he said. "What did they want?" Maggie asked. Eleanor answered before Rhett could. "They were looking for someone," she said. She said it evenly, looking at Maggie, and the look between them was a whole conversation that Rhett wasn't part of and didn't interrupt. "They're gone now." "Were they—" "They're gone," Eleanor said again, firm, not hard. The voice of someone closing a subject in a way that was protective rather than dismissive. Maggie pressed her mouth together and nodded. She unfolded her arms and looked at the table, and Rhett recognized in her posture the particular exhaustion of a child who has been waiting for something bad to happen long enough that the waiting itself had become the wait. He went back outside and found a fence rail that needed attention because he needed something to do with his hands, and he stood in the sun and worked and thought about what Dodd had said. Family matter. Kinfolk. He thought about the way Aldrich had looked at the house. He thought about Eleanor's voice when she'd said they don't always use the same ones, said it with a flatness that told him this had happened before. Not this exact thing, but something close to it. Men arriving. Questions being asked. The particular terror of being found. He thought about the word yet again. What she had said on the porch. "I can't. Not yet." He had respected it then. He was going to have to reconsider that respect. He found her in the kitchen garden an hour later, which is where she went when things were difficult, he had come to understand. She was kneeling beside the squash and not really doing anything to it, just kneeling there with her hands in the soil. He crouched down across the bed from her. "Eleanor," he said, "I'm not asking you to tell me everything. I'm asking you to tell me enough." She didn't look up right away. When she did, the thing he saw in her face was not fear exactly. It was something more exhausted than fear, something that had been fear so many times for so long that it had compressed itself into something denser. "Enough for what?" she said. "Enough so I can protect what's on my land," he said. "My land includes your children." She looked at him steadily. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the squash plants in front of her and was quiet for a moment. "His name is Victor Harlan," she said. Her voice was level and careful, the voice she used when she was being precise. "He's a businessman. He operates out of Santa Fe mostly, but he has money and interests in a dozen counties. He's the kind of man that other men are afraid to argue with." She paused. "He wanted to marry me after my husband died. He made it very clear that he considered this, decided, that I had agreed to something I hadn't agreed to. And when you refused, he didn't accept it." She said this simply, without drama, the way you state a geographic fact. "He thinks I belong to him. He has thought so for 3 years. Every time I've moved, he's found us eventually and sent men to remind me that he's still looking." She looked at her hands in the dirt. "He hasn't found us here yet. I don't know if those men today knew who they were talking about or if it was general inquiries. Victor is systematic. He casts a wide net and closes it slowly." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "He's hurt you?" She met his eyes. "Not directly. He knows how to use other things." She paused. "He threatened to take the children through legal means. He has lawyers who could do it. Make it look as if I was unfit. It wouldn't be true, but truth isn't always the point." "No," Rhett said. "It's not." She looked out at the garden. "I should probably tell you we should leave," she said. "If those men traced us here and they go back and report, it won't be long before—" She stopped. "I should probably say that." "What do you actually want to say?" he asked. She was quiet again, longer this time. "That I'm tired," she said finally. "That my children are tired. That for the first time in 3 years we've been in one place long enough for things to grow." She looked at the tomato plants at the end of the bed. "I don't want to leave." Rhett looked at the garden. He looked at the house behind them and the land around it, his land, the land his father had built, and his father's father before that, the land he had maintained alone for 3 years out of something between duty and inertia. "You're not leaving," he said. She looked at him. "Those men didn't get anything from me," he said. "If they go back with nothing, it might buy time. And if Harlan sends someone else, or if he comes himself," he stopped, making a deliberate decision, "then we deal with that when it happens. But you're not leaving." "Rhett," she said, and there was a caution in it, a care, almost a flinching, the way someone speaks when they're afraid of counting on something. "You don't know what this man is capable of." "I know what I'm capable of," he said. He stood up from his crouch and brushed the dirt from his knees and went back to the fence rail he'd been working on. He didn't look back because he didn't think she needed him to, and because looking back would have made it sentimental in a way that would have embarrassed them both. Behind him, in the garden, Eleanor Pierce stayed where she was for a while. He heard once a sound that might have been a controlled exhale, or might have been something else she'd been carrying and was setting down, carefully. The way you set down something that's been heavy long enough that you've stopped trusting the ground. That evening, Rhett went to town. He did not tell Eleanor where he was going. He told Thomas he'd be back before dark and to keep an eye out, and Thomas nodded with a gravity that was sometimes too old for his face. He found the sheriff in his office, which was where the sheriff typically was at 4 in the afternoon, working through the particular stack of papers that never seemed to actually diminish. "Rhett," said Sheriff Calvin Reyes, looking up. They'd known each other 15 years. Calvin was a compact, dark-haired man with a careful mind and the tendency to keep his conclusions to himself until they were fully formed. "What brings you in?" Rhett sat down in the chair across from the desk. "2 men came to my property today," he said. "Gave their names as Dodd and Aldrich. They were asking about a widow woman and her children." Calvin's expression didn't shift much, but Rhett knew him well enough to see the attention sharpen behind his eyes. "That a problem?" "Might be," Rhett said. "They said it was a family matter, specifically said they hadn't come to the sheriff's office." He let that sit for a moment. "Calvin, you know a man named Victor Harlan?" The change in the sheriff's face was subtle but there, the slight tightening, the careful neutral that came down like a shade over a window. "I know the name," he said. "How do you know it?" Calvin set down his pen. "He's made some land purchases in the county in the last couple years," he said, with the measured evenness of a man choosing each word with care. "Has interests in some of the water rights further east. He's been present in a business capacity." "He send men into your county to track down a woman?" Rhett asked directly. Calvin looked at him for a long moment. "Is that what those men were doing?" "That's what I'm asking you." "And the woman in question," Calvin said, "she's on your property?" "She works for me," Rhett said. "She and her children." Calvin picked up his pen and put it down again. He had a habit of doing that when he was thinking something he wasn't sure he wanted to say out loud yet. "Victor Harlan," he said carefully, "is the kind of man who gets what he wants through legal mechanisms when he can and other mechanisms when he can't. He has resources. He has connections with people who have connections." He looked at Rhett steadily. "If a woman left Santa Fe to get away from him, and he spent 3 years finding her, she didn't leave over a minor disagreement." "No," Rhett said. "She didn't." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "She willing to make a formal statement?" "Not yet," Rhett said. "She's—" He thought about how to say it. "She's been running long enough that she's not sure what trusting institutions looks like. Give it time." "Time might be something you don't have a lot of," Calvin said, not unkindly. "If Harlan sent those men and they report back, he'll want a more direct approach." "I know that. And you're prepared for that." "Yes," Rhett said. Calvin looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he nodded once, picked up his pen for real this time, and said, "I'll look into the 2 men, see if they're still in town. And Rhett—" He waited until Rhett had gotten up and was at the door. "You watch yourself out there. Men like Harlan don't lose gracefully." "I know it," Rhett said. He went back out into the afternoon, mounted up, and rode home. The sun was getting low when he turned onto the ranch road, throwing long shadows across the scrub. He could see smoke from the kitchen chimney, the garden beds green and dark in the evening light, the horses moving slow and easy in the paddock. In the distance, Thomas was closing the barn door and Charlie was helping in the specific, unhelpful way of a 6-year-old that Thomas had long since learned to simply accommodate. He unsaddled his horse, fed and watered her, and stood in the barn for a moment in the quiet that isn't really quiet. The small sounds of animals settling, the creak of the structure, the particular warm smell of hay and horses that Rhett had known since before he could name it. Something had shifted on his property. He felt it the way you feel a change in weather, not with certainty, but with the bone-deep knowledge that the conditions had changed and that what was coming next would require something different of him than what the last few years had. He walked to the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Eleanor moving at the stove, and Maggie saying something that made Eleanor turn and say something back, and Charlie pushing through the door with his hat askew and his boots muddy, and Thomas right behind him. Rhett stood outside the window for a moment and looked at this. The lit kitchen, the moving figures, the particular chaos and order of a family in the last hour before supper. Then he went inside. He washed up at the pump and sat down at the table, and Maggie put a bowl in front of him, and Charlie climbed into the chair beside him and knocked over the salt shaker and then looked at the ceiling as though this had happened independent of him. And Thomas said something quiet to Maggie that made her almost smile. Eleanor sat down across from him. She looked at him for a moment with something in her face that was not quite gratitude and not quite fear and not quite relief, but was all of those things moved past and compressed into something steadier. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They ate supper and the light went low outside, and somewhere further out on the flats a dry wind was beginning to move through the sage, carrying no particular message except that the land was still there and the night was coming and that whatever was going to come next was still a ways off. For now, the supper was hot and the children were fed and the house was full of sound. That was enough. It had to be, because it was what they had. The 2 weeks that followed the visit from Dodd and Aldrich were quiet in the way that a held breath is quiet. Not peaceful, just suspended. Rhett didn't change his routines in any obvious way. He still rode the fence lines in the morning, still went to town when supplies required it, still sat on the porch in the evenings with his coffee. But he slept lighter now, and he had moved the rifle from the closet shelf to the rack above the front door. And he had, without making a production of it, begun noting every unfamiliar horse on the road and every stranger who glanced too long at the ranch gate when they passed. Eleanor noticed. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything, cataloged it, and decided later what to do with the information. She didn't comment on the rifle. She didn't ask him what he'd said to the sheriff. She watched him with those gray eyes that saw more than most people intended to show, and she waited, the way she had apparently learned to wait for what was coming. Thomas noticed, too, in the particular way that 10-year-olds notice things they're not supposed to, through peripheral attention and the careful absence of questions. He started staying closer to the house in the evenings. Rhett found him one morning in the barn, awake before dawn and checking something that didn't need checking, just being present in a place where he could hear the road. Rhett stood in the barn door and watched the boy work and thought about what it cost a 10-year-old to be that vigilant, and didn't like the answer he came to. "Thomas," he said. The boy looked up. "You don't need to do that." Thomas looked at him steadily. "I know, Pum," he said. He went back to what he was doing. He did it again 2 days later. Rhett didn't say anything the second time. Some burdens couldn't be argued away. They could only be shared. Calvin Reyes came by on a Wednesday, which was unexpected. The sheriff wasn't a man who made social calls without a reason. He tied his horse at the post and came to the porch and accepted the coffee Rhett offered with the air of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "Dodd and Aldrich left town the day after they came to your place," Calvin said. "Stayed one night at the hotel, asked a few questions at the saloon, and headed out toward the East Road." "Toward Santa Fe," Rhett said. "That direction, yes." Calvin turned his coffee mug in his hands. "I made some inquiries through the circuit. Victor Harlan is... The picture that comes back is not a good one, Rhett. He's got land holdings in 4 counties, has had disputes with 2 of them that got settled in his favor in ways that don't entirely make sense if you look at how the law was applied." He paused. "There's also a record of a complaint filed in Santa Fe about 3 years ago. A woman alleging harassment and unlawful threat. The complaint was withdrawn. Swat." Rhett looked at him. "Withdrawn," Calvin said again, with a deliberateness that meant something. "Doesn't mean it wasn't true. Means someone applied pressure to the process. Or to the woman, Rhett said. Or to the woman, Calvin agreed. He drank his coffee and looked out at the land. I'm not going to tell you what to do here. You know your property and you know your situation. What I'll tell you is that if Harlan decides to come at this directly, he'll do it with lawyers first if he can. He prefers the legal mechanism because it's cleaner and it's deniable. He looked at Rhett. If the woman has anything, any documentation, any evidence of what he's done, now would be the time to be thinking about that. I'll pass that along, Rhett said. Calvin finished his coffee and stood up. He was at the steps when he turned back. She doing all right? He asked. Not officially, just as a man asking. She's managing, Rhett said. That's what she does. Calvin nodded once, put his hat on, and rode back toward town. Rhett sat with his empty mug and thought about what documentation might look like, and about a woman who had been running for 3 years and who had perhaps been too busy surviving to think about building a case. He found Eleanor that afternoon in the small room off the kitchen that had become, by gradual process, her workspace. A table where she kept the household accounts alongside Maggie's supply ledger, where she mended and planned and did the 100 small administrative acts that kept the ranch running at its current level of function. She looked up when he came to the door. He told her what Calvin had said. He told her plainly, without softening it, because she had a right to the unvarnished version, and because he had learned that she handled plain truth better than she handled careful framing. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, He'll have made sure there's nothing that implicates him directly. That's how he operates. Everything is done through other people. Dodd and Aldrich, if you asked them, would say they were just hired to find a woman whose family was concerned about her. Victor would have no connection to it in any formal record. What about the complaint that was withdrawn? Rhett asked. Something moved through her face. I filed it, she said. 8 months after Daniel died, Victor had been escalating. He sent men to my house. He told me very clearly what would happen if I didn't cooperate with what he wanted. She looked at the table. I went to the sheriff's office in Santa Fe and I made a formal statement. 3 days later, 2 men came to the house and told me that if I didn't withdraw the complaint, they would take my children from me. They said Victor had a lawyer who could make a case that I was mentally unfit, that Daniel's death had destabilized me. She said the word with a flat contempt that was more powerful than anger. I had 3 children under the age of 9 and no money and no family nearby. I withdrew the complaint. I packed what I could carry, and I left. Rhett absorbed this in silence. He looked at her hands on the table, steady, always steady, and thought about the particular kind of courage it took to sit there and say this quietly to a man you'd known 8 weeks. If you could get to Santa Fe, he said carefully, to the right lawyer, one that Harlan doesn't have a connection to, is there anything you could document now? Your account, the threat, the circumstances of the withdrawal. My account is my account, she said, against a man with money and lawyers and relationships. She paused. But there is something. When we left Santa Fe, I took some of Daniel's papers. Daniel kept records. He had a habit of writing things down, every agreement, every conversation that mattered. Before he died, he wrote down things that Victor had told him, about his business practices, about the way he acquired certain properties. She looked up. I don't know if any of it is legally sufficient. I'm not a lawyer, but I have those papers. Where? Rhett said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went to the wardrobe in the back room and came back with a battered tin box, the kind meant for documents, with a small lock on it. I've had this since we left, she said. She set it on the table between them. I've moved it from house to house, and I've never opened it because every time I thought about opening it, I thought about Daniel writing these things down and I couldn't. She pressed her lips together. It seemed like the last thing I had of him that was still intact. Rhett looked at the box. He didn't say anything for a moment. You don't have to open it today, he said. I know, she said, but I think I have to open it soon. She didn't open it that day. She opened it 4 days later on a Sunday morning alone. And when Rhett came in from the barn, he found her at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of her, and her jaw set and her eyes clear in the particular way of someone who has done a hard thing and is still doing it. He sat down across from her, and she walked him through what was there. Daniel Pierce had been, it emerged, a methodical and careful man. His records were dated, specific, and written in a clear hand. There were accounts of 3 separate conversations with Victor Harlan, in which Harlan had described in frank terms how he had acquired 2 parcels of land in the North County, descriptions that, if accurate, amounted to fraud. There were notes about a business arrangement that Harlan had pressured Daniel to enter and that Daniel had eventually refused, and about the conversation that had followed that refusal, which had included what Daniel had recorded as a direct statement that refusal would carry consequences. There were also 2 letters written by Harlan himself, which Eleanor had kept without entirely knowing why. Letters that, in their careful language, still managed to make clear a pattern of possessiveness and coercive intent that a careful lawyer could work with. "This is something," Rhett said when she had walked him through the last of it. "Maybe," she said. She stacked the papers back in their order, the order Daniel had kept them. "Or maybe it's a dead man's notes, and 2 letters from a careful man who knows how to be threatening without being explicit." "Calvin knows a lawyer in Albuquerque," Rhett said. "Man named Freer. He's handled land fraud cases, and Calvin says he's not the kind that gets bought." Eleanor looked at him. "You've already talked to Calvin about a lawyer." "I've talked to Calvin about options," Rhett said. "Not about specifics, not about you by name. The specifics are yours to decide." She looked at the tin box for a long moment. "If I go to a lawyer and he decides to move and Victor finds out before anything is in place—" "I know," Rhett said. "He'll accelerate," she said. "He'll stop with the quiet inquiries and he'll come at it directly." "I know that too, Rhett." She said his name with a weight that was different from how she usually said it. "I need you to understand what that might look like. When I say he'll come at it directly, I mean he'll come here, with men, with whatever force he thinks is necessary." She held his gaze. "This is not a man who accepts the word no." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then he and I have that particular thing in common." She looked at him. Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, more like a wall that had been standing at a slight angle for a long time, settling onto a solid foundation. "I'll write to Calvin's lawyer," she said. She wrote the letter that afternoon. The reply came back in under 2 weeks, which was faster than Rhett had expected, and told him something about Calvin's message to Freer, that it had been framed with an urgency that the timeline warranted. Freer wanted to see the documents. He asked if Mrs. Pierce could come to Albuquerque, and if not, he could arrange to come to them, at some cost to his time that he was willing to absorb if the case was what he thought it might be. Eleanor read the letter twice. She folded it and put it in the tin box with Daniel's papers, and went out to the garden and stayed there for an hour. When she came back in, she said, "He should come here. I don't want to take the children on the road right now." "I'll write him back today," Rhett said. Freer arrived on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later in a buggy that had been well built and was now dusty from the road. He was a man of about 60, with white hair and a face that had settled into a kind of considered blankness that was, Rhett noted, very good for a lawyer. He looked at nothing with surprise. He shook Eleanor's hand without condescension, which was not a universal trait in men of his profession, and he accepted Maggie's coffee with a brief thanks and no comment on being served by a 12-year-old. They sat at the kitchen table, Eleanor, Freer, and Rhett, and Eleanor opened the tin box for the second time and spread Daniel's papers in their order. Freer went through them slowly. He asked questions in a quiet voice, practical questions, dates and locations, and the names of people mentioned. He read the 2 letters from Harlan with particular attention, going back over them twice. When he was done, he sat back and folded his hands on the table. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, "I want to be honest with you because I think you're a woman who prefers that." "I am," she said. "The documents your husband kept are useful. The letters from Harlan are potentially significant. They establish a pattern of intent that a judge would find relevant in the context of what followed." He paused. "What is missing is corroborating testimony. Your husband is gone. The men Harlan used as intermediaries are likely either gone or in his employ. Your own testimony is valuable, but it will be characterized as interested, a woman motivated by a desire to escape an arrangement." He looked at her steadily. "What I would need, to build something Harlan can't simply buy his way around, is additional witnesses. Anyone who saw what happened in Santa Fe. Anyone who can speak to the land fraud, which has separate legal consequences for him. Anyone he's done this to before. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. There was a woman, she said slowly, as if she was pulling something from somewhere she hadn't looked in a long time. In Santa Fe. Her name was Beatrice Okafor. She was a neighbor. She saw Victor's men come to my house. She saw the state I was in when I went to file the complaint and when I withdrew it. She paused. I don't know where she is now. If you can give me a last known address and anything else you remember about her, I'll have someone find her. He made a note. The land fraud is actually the stronger avenue legally. Do you know the names of the men whose land Harlan acquired from your husband's notes? It's written down, Eleanor said. She pointed to a page in Daniel's handwriting. 2 families, the Hendersons and a man named Colbert. Finding them and getting statements about the conditions of the sale, that's something I can pursue through the county records. He closed his notebook. Mrs. Pierce, I can't promise you a fast resolution. Building a case against a man with Harlan's resources takes time and care. But I can tell you that what you have here is more than most people come to me with. Your husband was a thorough man. Eleanor looked at the papers for a moment. He was, she said. Freer left mid-afternoon with the letters, originals, with Eleanor's written authorization, and a copy of Daniel's key documents. He had shaken both their hands at the door and had said to Rhett, not to Eleanor, keep them safe, with the directness of a man who was assessing a situation accurately. That's the plan, Rhett had said. The plan lasted 9 days before everything accelerated. It was Thomas who saw them first. He came in from the east pasture at a run, which was something Rhett had never seen him do, and he came to the barn where Rhett was working without stopping at the house, which told Rhett something about urgency and about what the boy had thought through in the time it took to cover the distance. Riders, Thomas said, breathing hard but controlled. 7 of them, coming in from the north road. They're not moving slow. 7. Rhett set down his tools with a deliberateness that was the opposite of what he was feeling. How far? 20 minutes, maybe less. Thomas swallowed. One of them, in the front. He's dressed different from the others, not like a hired hand. What does he look like? Thomas described him with the compressed accuracy of a boy who had learned to observe carefully. Big, well-dressed, dark hat, riding a black horse that was considerably better than the others, riding ahead of the group in a way that said he was accustomed to that position. Rhett looked at the boy. Go to the house. Tell your mother. Tell her to stay inside with your sisters and your brother until I come for her. He paused. Can you do that without running? I don't want whoever's watching the road to see anyone running. Thomas considered this for 1 second. Then he straightened up, adjusted his hat, and walked to the house at a pace that was quick but controlled. Rhett watched him go and thought, that boy is going to be all right, whatever happens to the rest of this. He went to the house himself, by the back way, and came in through the kitchen. Eleanor was already there. Thomas had done what he was told, and more. Maggie had Charlie on her lap in the back room, and the door was closed, and Eleanor was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the north road. It's him, she said, without turning. She said it with a flatness that was past fear, the flatness that comes when a thing you have been dreading for years finally stops being future tense. I knew when Thomas described the horse, Victor always rides black. Eleanor. She turned. I need you to stay in the house, he said. I'm going to go out front and I'm going to talk to him. I need you to stay back until I say otherwise. You can't talk to Victor, she said. Talking to Victor is not... He doesn't come here to talk, Rhett. He came here with 7 men because he's done being patient. I know what he came here for, Rhett said, but he's on my land, and on my land I set the terms. He doesn't respect terms. He will respect mine. Rhett went to the front door and took the rifle from the rack above it. He checked it, not because it needed checking, but because the act of checking it was the act of a man who was being deliberate rather than reactive. He pulled his sidearm and checked that too. Is the back door locked? Not yet. Lock it. And Eleanor... He looked at her directly, and she looked back at him with those gray eyes that were steady even now, even with everything in them that they held. Whatever happens out there, you don't come out until I call you. Do you understand? Rhett, I need your word. She held his gaze for a long moment. You have it, she said. He went out the front door. The riders were visible now from the porch, 7 of them, as Thomas had said, coming up the ranch road at a controlled walk that communicated the confidence of men who did not expect to be turned back. The man in front was exactly as Thomas had described him. Victor Harlan was perhaps 45, broad through the chest, with the kind of physical presence that came from believing absolutely in your own authority. He was well dressed in a way that was meant to be noticed, not flashy, but expensive, the clothes of a man who wanted you to understand the gulf between you. He pulled up about 30 feet from the porch. His men fanned out behind him in an arrangement that was practiced enough to look casual and wasn't. "Mr. Calloway," Harlan said. His voice was a cultivated thing, controlled and pleasant, and carrying an accent that had been educated out of its origins. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has never needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. "I appreciate you coming out. It saves the inconvenience of knocking." "Mr. Harlan?" Rhett said. He stood on the porch with the rifle across his arm, not pointed, just present. "You're on private property." "I'm aware." Harlan looked at the ranch with the specific expression of a man assessing value. "Nice spread. Your father built it, I believe." "You're not here about my father's land." "No," Harlan agreed pleasantly. "I'm here about Eleanor Pierce. I believe she's on your property, which is either because you've been deceived about who she is or because you've chosen to involve yourself in a private matter." He paused, still pleasant. "I'm hoping it's the former." "She works here," Rhett said. "Her and her children." "Ah." Harlan nodded, as though this confirmed something. "She's good at that, making herself useful, making herself seem necessary." A brief, careful smile. "Eleanor has a talent for making men feel that she needs their protection. I assure you she doesn't. She's under the care of my concern, and she left the arrangements we'd made without the appropriate conclusion to things." "She's a free woman who made a free choice," Rhett said. Harlan looked at him. For the first time, the pleasantness slipped, just slightly, around the edges. "Mr. Calloway, I've come a long way, and I've been looking for Eleanor for a considerable time. I have legal matters that require her cooperation, and I have," he paused, "a personal interest in her well-being that I intend to see settled. I would prefer to resolve this civilly. I'd ask you to send her out, and we can all avoid an unpleasantness." "No," Rhett said. Harlan's expression didn't change exactly. Something under it did. "I'm sorry?" "No," Rhett said again, in exactly the same tone. "She's not coming out. You're going to turn your horses around and go back the way you came, and if you have legal matters, you can pursue them through an actual court." He looked at Harlan steadily. "You don't want to push this further than this." There was a silence. Behind Harlan, the men had gone still in the particular way of men waiting for an instruction. Harlan looked at Rhett, at the rifle, at the set of his shoulders, at the house behind him, and for a moment something calculated behind his eyes. He was weighing. This was a man who weighed things very carefully before he committed to them, which was how he'd stayed on the right side of the law as long as he had. "You're making a serious error," Harlan said quietly. The pleasantness was gone now. "The law is on my side in this." "Then use it," Rhett said. "Courthouse is that way. Sheriff's office is on the same street." Something moved through Harlan's face that was darker than anything he'd shown so far. He looked at the house one more time, and his jaw tightened with the look of a man making a decision. "Set him down," he said. It came from the left. It came fast. One of the men had swung down from his horse and was moving toward the porch steps with a speed that said this was the plan all along. The talk was just the opening to get Rhett's attention oriented forward, while the action came from the side. Rhett turned and brought the rifle up, and the man stopped. "Don't," Rhett said. The man stopped. He was 3 feet from the porch steps, hand near his gun, and he was looking at Rhett's rifle and making the same calculation that Harlan was making from horseback, whether Rhett would actually pull the trigger. The answer was yes. It was clearly yes. It was the kind of yes that doesn't require stating. The man stepped back, and then the front door of the house opened. Rhett's heart did something that he later described to himself only as a drop, a hard, sudden drop. Because he had her word, he had asked for her word, and she had given it. But Eleanor Pierce came through the front door of her own accord with a rifle. his second rifle, from the closet, the one she had apparently located and loaded at some point in the last 20 minutes, and she came to stand on the porch beside him with a steadiness in her hands and her face that Rhett would think about for a very long time afterward. She looked at Victor Harlan. He looked at her. "Eleanor," he said, and the word carried a weight of possession that made Rhett want to step forward. He held where he was. "Victor," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I'm not going with you. You don't have a choice in—" "I have documented evidence," she said, cutting through him cleanly, the way a sharp edge cuts, "of fraud in the acquisition of the Henderson and Colbert properties. I have letters in your handwriting that establish a pattern of coercion. I have filed these materials with a lawyer in Albuquerque who has already made contact with the county court." She paused, and the pause was exact, precise. "I am not running from you anymore. And if you push this one step further, I will not need to. You will be the one running." Baal Saboshi Marshima. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the ones before it. Harlan's face had gone very still. That was what Rhett noticed. Not anger, not bluster, but a very precise stillness. The stillness of a man doing rapid and serious calculation about what he had just heard, about what it meant, about whether she was telling the truth. She was. That was obvious to Rhett. Whether it was obvious to Harlan depended on whether Harlan had come prepared to believe that Eleanor Pierce had spent 8 weeks doing anything except hiding. He hadn't expected it. That was clear. "You're bluffing," Harlan said, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite as certain as the words. "Then test it," Eleanor said. "Go ahead. Come up these steps." Nobody moved. The man who had started toward the porch was very still. The 6 men on horseback were very still. Harlan was very still. And in the stillness, a sound became audible that had been building for the last 3 minutes without Rhett consciously registering it. The sound of a horse approaching from the road to town. 2 horses, as it turned out. Calvin Reyes came around the ridgeline with a deputy beside him, moving at a pace that was not quite a gallop and was not accidental in its timing. He pulled up behind Harlan's group, taking in the arrangement on the porch, and the arrangement of men in front of it with the brisk professional assessment of a man who had seen this kind of configuration before. "Mr. Harlan," Calvin said from behind, so that Harlan had to turn his horse. "I was notified you might be coming through the county. I thought I'd come out and make sure everyone stays on good terms." He let his eyes move across the 7 men with their hands near their guns, and the man on foot 3 feet from Rhett's porch steps. "This looks like a civil disagreement to me. Civil disagreements don't require this kind of attendance." Harlan looked at the sheriff. His face was carefully composed again, the pleasantness back in place, but it sat differently now, like clothing put back on in too much of a hurry. "Sheriff," he said, "I heard what you were simply," Calvin said, "and I'll tell you that Mrs. Pierce has rights in this county the same as any other person, and that if you have a legal matter, you need to pursue it in a court and not on a private man's land with 7 armed companions." He looked at Harlan steadily. "I'll ask you and your men to turn around now." A very long moment. Then Victor Harlan turned his horse. He didn't say anything else. He turned, and his men turned with him, and the man on foot remounted, and they went back down the ranch road the way they had come. Not fast, not panicked, but gone. Rhett let out a breath that he had been holding for what felt like 10 minutes. He looked at Eleanor beside him. She was watching the road, watching Harlan's back as he rode away, and she was still holding the rifle, and her hands were not shaking, but he could see in the line of her jaw what it had cost to stand there and say what she had said. "Eleanor," he said quietly. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright in a way that was not tears exactly, and was not relief exactly, and was something compounded of both. "You gave me your word you'd stay inside," he said. "I know," she said. "And?" She looked back at the road where Harlan had disappeared. "I've been letting men tell me what to do with myself for 3 years," she said. "I decided that needed to stop." Calvin rode up to the porch and looked at them both. "Everybody all right?" "Yes," Rhett said. "Good." Calvin looked at the road, then back. "He'll regroup," he said. "I want to be clear about that. What happened today slowed him down. It didn't stop him. If her lawyer is moving on the fraud case, we might have enough to bring charges that force his hand, but today was not the end of it." "I know," Eleanor said. She said it without the weight she might have said it with a month ago. But today I didn't run. Calvin nodded slowly. No, he said. You didn't. He stayed for 30 minutes, enough to see the road was clear and to talk through what the next steps with Freer would need to look like. When he left, the afternoon was getting long, the shadows stretching eastward across the land. Rhett sat on the porch steps after Calvin rode out. Eleanor sat beside him. Not pressed together, just beside. The way two people sit who have stood next to each other through something and don't need to talk about it immediately. The back door banged open and Charlie came out at a dead run and went directly to Eleanor and buried his face in her shoulder. And she put her arm around him and held him without a word. Thomas came out behind him and stood at the porch rail looking down the road with the expression of someone reviewing what had happened and filing it properly. Maggie came last and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and the look on her face of someone who had been very frightened and was converting it, rapidly, into something more manageable.
They're gone, Maggie said. For now, Eleanor said. Good, Maggie said, with a vehemence that was very 12 years old. She went back inside. Thomas looked at Rhett. You didn't back down, he said. No, Rhett said. The boy nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, My dad would have. He said it without blame, just as a fact he'd been sitting with for 3 years. He wasn't good at not backing down.
Rhett looked at him. Your dad kept records, he said. That took its own kind of courage. Thomas considered this. Yeah, he said, after a moment. I guess it did. He went back inside, too. Rhett sat on the steps. Charlie had fallen half asleep against Eleanor's shoulder in the way of children whose fear has exhausted them. The sun was moving toward the ridge, and the land was going gold and long-shadowed, the way it did in the hours before dark, the way Rhett had watched it go since he was a boy on this same land. He'll come back, Eleanor said quietly, so Charlie wouldn't hear. Yes, Rhett said. But this time I have something, she said. This time I'm not just running. Rhett looked at the road, empty now, the dust of Harlan's departure already settled back into the ground. You weren't just running today, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said with a difficulty that told him it wasn't something she said easily or often, I couldn't let you stand out there alone. Rhett looked at her. She was looking at the road, not at him. Thank you, he said. It was a plain thing to say, and plain was what the moment called for. They sat there as the light went down, and the ranch settled into its evening sounds. Horses and distance, and the first crickets beginning, and somewhere inside the house, Maggie at the stove, and Thomas's quiet footsteps, and the ordinary sound of a family at the end of a hard day. Whatever came next was coming. Rhett knew it, and Eleanor knew it, and they both sat with that knowledge in the fading gold of the afternoon without pretending otherwise. But tonight the danger had backed down the road and left them standing, and that was enough to carry into the dark. Calvin Reyes was right. Harlan regrouped. It took 11 days. 11 days of the kind of quiet that Rhett had learned to distrust. Not the empty quiet of before Eleanor arrived, but a taut, listening quiet, the quiet of a held wire. He rode his fence lines every morning and watched the roads and slept in 4-hour stretches and didn't say most of what he was thinking to Eleanor because she was already carrying enough of it herself. She knew, anyway. She always knew. It was one of the things about her that was occasionally inconvenient and more often just true. What Harlan sent this time was not men with guns. He sent a lawyer. The man arrived on a Wednesday morning in a hired buggy from town, carrying a leather satchel and wearing a suit that was too heavy for the New Mexico heat and sweating in it with the stubborn dignity of someone who had decided the suit was non-negotiable. His name was Presswick, and he had the careful, practiced pleasantness of men whose entire professional purpose was to deliver bad news in language that made it sound like good sense. He asked for Eleanor by name. Rhett told him to wait on the porch, went inside, and came back out with Eleanor and then stayed where he was, which Presswick attempted to address with a pointed look that Rhett did not respond to. Presswick opened his satchel and produced a document. He presented it to Eleanor with a brief summary. It was a petition for a competency hearing filed in Santa Fe, which, if granted, would initiate a formal review of her fitness as a parent and legal guardian of her 3 minor children. Eleanor took the document. She read it. Her face did not change in any way that Presswick could have read, but Rhett, standing 5 feet away, saw her jaw tighten twice in the 30 seconds it took her to go through the first page. "Who filed this?" she said. "My client," Presswick said. "Mr. Victor Harlan, acting in his capacity as a concerned private citizen with documented evidence of—" "Your client," Eleanor said, "is a man who threatened to take my children 3 years ago to force me to withdraw a complaint I filed against him. I withdrew the complaint. I left Santa Fe to protect my children from him, and now he is using the children as the mechanism again." She folded the document with a precision that was controlled, rage made physical. "What is the hearing date?" Presswick blinked slightly. He had expected different. "The petition has been filed. A hearing date will be set upon—" "What is the expected timeline?" 30 to 60 days, depending on the— "Thank you," Eleanor said. She handed the document back to him. "I'll be in contact through my own legal representation. You can tell Mr. Harlan that his petition will be contested." Presswick looked at her for a moment with an expression that was very briefly not practiced at all. Then he put the document back in his satchel, nodded once, and went back to his buggy. Rhett waited until the buggy was out of the gate. "You have 30 to 60 days, he said. "I know the math," Eleanor said. She had her arms crossed and she was looking at the road. "I need to write to Freer today." "I'll ride the letter to town myself," Rhett said. "We can get it on the afternoon post." She turned and went inside without another word. He gave her 10 minutes, then followed. She was at the kitchen table writing. The letter was already half done. She wrote quickly when she knew what she needed to say, and she had apparently known immediately. He sat down across from her and let her finish. Charlie came through the kitchen looking for something, and Eleanor pointed without looking up at the biscuit tin on the shelf. And Charlie took 2 biscuits and went back out. And the normalcy of that small exchange, the biscuits, the wordless pointing, the child patting out with both fists full, sat in the room with him like evidence of what was actually at stake. "He's escalating the way you said he would," Rhett said when she'd set down her pen. "Yes." She folded the letter. "The petition is almost certainly frivolous on its merits. I have 3 children who are fed and housed and attending school when we're in one place long enough for it, and there's no documented evidence of any failure on my part because there isn't any." She looked at him. "But frivolous petitions can still consume months of a person's life and money they don't have if the person doesn't have the right representation. Victor knows that. He's not trying to win the petition. He's trying to make the fight expensive enough that I fold." "You're not going to fold," Rhett said. "No," she said, "but I might have 3 months ago." She said it plainly, without embarrassment. "Without the documents, without Freer, without—" She stopped and didn't finish the sentence, but her eyes moved briefly to the kitchen, the house, the implicit rest of it. "Write down everything you remember about Presswick," Rhett said. "What he said, how he said it, what he showed you. Freer will want it." She nodded and picked up her pen again. He took the finished letter and wrote it to town. Freer's response came in 8 days, which told Rhett the lawyer had been waiting for exactly this move and had prepared for it. His letter was 4 pages, which was long for Freer, whose professional instinct was compression. He outlined the counterfiling he intended to make, noted that the land fraud investigation had produced a statement from a man named Edmund Colbert, who was willing to testify that the conditions of his land sale to Harlan had involved coercion and misrepresentation. He had also located Beatrice Okafor, who was living in Taos and who had agreed to provide a written statement about what she had witnessed in the weeks before Eleanor left Santa Fe. At the bottom of the last page, in handwriting that was less careful than the rest, as if it had been added quickly, "The fraud case is strengthening. If we can get Colbert to a circuit court judge before Harlan's lawyers manage to delay it, we may be in a position to move. Keep her steady. Keep her there." Eleanor read this 3 times. She read the part about Beatrice Okafor twice more. She agreed, Eleanor said quietly, to no one in particular. She was looking at the letter with an expression Rhett hadn't seen before. Not relief, not gratitude, but something more like the particular feeling of discovering that someone you thought you'd lost still existed. "I didn't know if she would. I didn't know if she—" I thought about asking her when it happened, and I was so afraid of putting her in the middle of it that I didn't. She put herself in the middle of it, Rhett said. Freer found her, and she agreed. Eleanor set the letter down and pressed her palm flat against it on the table, as if she needed to feel that it was real. Beatrice had a daughter, she said, a little younger than Maggie. She used to let the girls play in her yard when the weather was good. She paused. Victor's men knocked on her door the night after I filed the complaint. They knocked on her door, and they told her to stay out of things that weren't her concern. She looked up. She stayed out of it then. She had to. She had her daughter. She's not staying out of it now, Rhett said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice that was carefully level, "People are braver than I give them credit for. I keep being surprised by that." "You're brave enough for most people," Rhett said without particular inflection. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes had, slightly sideways, like she was deciding what to do with the thing he'd said. "You're kinder than you think you are," she said, which was the most direct thing she had said to him that wasn't about the situation at hand, and she said it simply, without making it into anything, and picked up Freer's letter and went to write a reply. Rhett sat at the kitchen table for a moment after she'd gone, kinder than he thought he was. He turned that over. He was not sure that was true, but he noticed that the person who had said it was the person whose opinion of such things he'd found himself caring about, gradually and without making a decision to, the way water finds the low ground without being directed. He got up and went back to work. The circuit court date was set for 6 weeks out. Freer had moved with a speed that suggested he had connections in the court system that were being used thoughtfully and correctly, and the judge assigned was a man named Alderton, who had, according to Calvin's careful research, no documented relationship with Harlan's business interests. "That matters," Calvin said, when he wrote out the following week. He had been making a habit of that, writing out weekly, ostensibly to check on the situation, actually to be a visible presence on the road in case Harlan was watching for weaknesses. Rhett appreciated it without saying so. Calvin appreciated being appreciated without it being said. They had known each other long enough for this to work. "It matters," Rhett agreed. They were on the porch, the way they usually were. "Harlan will try to move the venue if he can," Calvin said. "Get it to a judge he has more comfort with. Freer will need to move fast to prevent that." He turned his hat in his hands. "I got a wire from a colleague in Santa Fe. Harlan has been in the city the last several days. He's meeting with his lawyers." He paused. "He's also made some inquiries about the property out east." "The water rights," Rhett said. He remembered this from their earlier conversation. "He's expanding his interest in the county," Calvin said, "which might mean he intends to be here more. Or it might mean he's consolidating assets because he's anticipating a fight and wants his position to be as strong as possible." He looked at Rhett. "Either way, he's not backing off." "No," Rhett said. "He's not the kind." They were quiet for a moment. The evening air was moving in from the hills, cooling after the hard heat of the day, and the land was doing the thing it did at this hour. Going softer, the colors shifting in a way that made it look like somewhere you might want to be if you were coming at it from the outside. "How are they doing?" Calvin asked, and Rhett knew he meant all of them, Eleanor and the children, and also, in the way Calvin asked things, Rhett himself. "Holding?" Rhett said. "Better than holding." Calvin nodded. "And you?" Rhett looked out at the land. "I'm all right," he said. Calvin looked at him with the expression of a man who knew Rhett Calloway well enough to not press further and also knew when pressing further was warranted, and was currently deciding which category this fell into. He apparently decided on not pressing. "Good," he said. He stayed for supper, which Maggie produced with the particular slight additional formality she brought to cooking when there were guests, which Calvin accepted with genuine appreciation and without making a fuss about it, which was exactly right. Thomas sat next to Calvin and asked him 2 careful questions about county law that Calvin answered seriously and without condescension. Charlie sat at his end of the table and ate with both hands, and at some point informed Calvin that Silver Button had learned a new thing, which was letting Charlie hang off her neck, and that this was a significant development. "That's a trusting horse," Calvin said. "She's my horse," Charlie said. "She belongs to your mother," Eleanor said. "She loves me more," Charlie said with the unassailable confidence of a 6-year-old who knows when he is right. Nobody argued the point. After Calvin left and the children were in their room, Rhett and Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with what was left of the coffee, which had gone past warm, but neither of them moved to fix it. This had become a pattern somewhere in the last weeks.
The evening sitting after supper, the particular quality of conversation that happened in that hour, when the day's work was done and the next day's concerns hadn't yet pressed into the space.
Freer wants me to travel to Albuquerque before the hearing, Eleanor said, to review the testimony structure with him, what I'll say, in what order, how to present Daniel's documents in context. When? 2 weeks out, he thinks. 3 or 4 days? She looked at the coffee mug between her hands. I'd need to take Maggie. I can't leave her here I can't leave her with people she doesn't know. She could stay here, Rhett said. All 3 of them could. Eleanor looked at him. Thomas and I have been managing the ranch together for 3 months, Rhett said. Maggie knows the kitchen better than I do. Charlie can supervise. He said the last part with a dryness that was close enough to a joke that Eleanor's mouth moved in spite of itself. They'll be fine here. They would be, Eleanor said carefully. But it's hard to leave them, he said. Not as a judgment, as a fact. I've never left them, she said. Not once. Not in 3 years of moving. She paused. I kept thinking, if I stayed with them, I could keep them safe. If I was there, I could be between them and whatever was coming. You couldn't always, Rhett said quietly. No, she said. I couldn't always. She looked at the table. I know they're safe here. I know that. I believe that. Believing it and actually leaving are 2 different things. They are, Rhett said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, was it that way with Clara? The not being able to keep someone safe even when you're there? He hadn't expected her to ask that, not directly. She rarely asked about Clara directly, in the way of someone who had decided that was private territory and wasn't hers to enter. He looked at his coffee mug. She got sick in the fall, he said. October. I thought it would pass. I had her in bed, I was bringing food, I sent for the doctor. We're 40 minutes from town. The doctor came twice, and the second time he said the lungs were the problem and that we'd have to wait. He paused. She died in February. I was there. I was in the room. I had been in the room every night for a month, and I still couldn't. He stopped. No, he said. Being there doesn't always mean keeping safe. Eleanor looked at him with the particular kind of attention she gave things she was deciding to hold carefully. I'm sorry, she said. Not the automatic sorry of politeness, the real one. It was 3 years ago, he said, which was not the same as saying it was past, and they both knew it, and neither said so. She put in the garden, Eleanor said after a moment. Yes, I thought about that, she said. When I started in it, I wasn't sure if it was. She paused, choosing her words. If you'd rather I hadn't. I watched you work it, he said, and I thought she would have said it looked the way it was supposed to look. He stopped. That was more than he'd intended to say, and more than he'd said to anyone in 3 years, and he was not entirely comfortable with having said it, but he also recognized that Eleanor Pierce was the kind of person who could hold something like that without it becoming something other than what it was. That's a kind thing, she said simply. She didn't expand it. She didn't make it into a bridge towards something else. She just let it sit where he'd put it. He appreciated that more than he had words for. Go to Albuquerque, he said, getting the conversation back to ground it could stand on. The children will be fine. Maggie will run the kitchen better without you there to consult. And Thomas will do the work of 2 men in his quiet way, and Charlie will appoint himself my advisor on all ranch matters. Eleanor laughed. It was not a polished sound. It caught slightly, like it had been surprised into existing, and it was short, but it was entirely real. He hadn't heard it before. That particular laugh, unguarded and briefly helpless. It changed her face in a way that was hard to look at directly. He has already appointed himself your advisor, she said. I know, Rhett said. I let him advise me on the north fence last week. His recommendation was that the post should be taller. That does sound like him. The coffee was cold. Neither of them moved to do anything about it. Outside, the night was fully in by now, and the land was quiet with the particular quiet of a late summer night, insects in distance, and the occasional sound of one of the horses shifting in the paddock. I'll write to Freer tomorrow, Eleanor said finally. Tell him the week he suggested is fine. She left for Albuquerque on a Tuesday, with Freer's address and the tin box of documents and a carpet bag that was not quite adequate for 4 days but was what she had. Maggie stood in the yard and hugged her in a way that was longer than Maggie's usual controlled embraces and shorter than either of them probably wanted. Thomas shook his mother's hand like a grown person, which made Eleanor reach up and pull him into a brief, fierce hug that he allowed with the slightly stiff dignity of a 10-year-old being caught in a moment of need. Charlie cried. He cried in the uncomplicated way of 6-year-olds who have not yet learned to manage it, standing with his fists at his sides and his face all wrong, and Eleanor crouched down and held his face in both hands and talked to him quietly for a long moment and wiped his face with her thumb, and told him something Rhett couldn't hear that made Charlie nod and swallow hard and straighten up. She looked at Rhett last. There wasn't much to say that they hadn't already said, and they both knew it, and she put her hand out the way she sometimes did, practically, to shake, the way you do with someone you work alongside, the way you do when sentiment is present and you're both choosing not to stand in it. He took her hand. He held it a moment longer than a handshake requires. "We'll be here," he said. "I know," she said. She let go and climbed up to the wagon and took the reins and went. The 4 days that followed were, in their way, clarifying. He worked the ranch with Thomas in the way they had worked it for the last months, except that the silence between them was different now. Fuller, somehow, more at ease with itself. Thomas was not a boy who needed constant conversation, and neither was Rhett, and they had discovered early on that this compatibility was efficient, and also, in its particular way, companionable. The boy learned fast and forgot nothing, and asked questions that were always about function rather than approval. On the second day, Thomas said, while they were resetting a gate hinge, "She's going to win, isn't she? The court thing." Rhett handed him the wrench. "The case is strong," he said. "Freer is good. There are witnesses now." "But is she going to win?" Thomas looked at him directly, the way he did when he wanted an honest answer and was prepared to handle it. "I think so," Rhett said. "I don't know for certain. The law doesn't always land where it should." He paused. "But this time, I think it will." Thomas was quiet for a moment, working the hinge. "She's been scared for 3 years," he said. "She doesn't show it, but—" He stopped. "I know," Rhett said. "I've been scared too," Thomas said, matter-of-factly, the way you state something that you've decided is just true and doesn't need management. "I wake up sometimes, and the first thing I do is listen to see if something's wrong." He glanced at Rhett. "I've been doing that since I was 8. Rhett looked at him. He thought about what it cost a 10-year-old to say that to a grown man he'd known for 4 months. The trust it required, the decision it represented. "You can stop doing that here," Rhett said. Thomas considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." They finished the gate in silence that was not uncomfortable at all. Maggie ran the kitchen with an efficiency that was, frankly, slightly better organized than Eleanor's, not because she was more capable, but because she had fewer things competing for her attention, and she was 12 and thriving on the authority. She produced 3 meals a day, kept the household accounts, mended 2 shirts and a pair of Thomas's trousers, and on the 3rd day asked Rhett, with the careful neutrality of someone who had been wanting to ask for a while, whether she could reorganize the root cellar. "Go ahead," Rhett said. The result was impressive enough that he stood in the cellar doorway for a moment when she showed him, taking in the regrouped organization. "Where'd you learn this?" he asked. "My dad," she said. "He kept things organized. He said the difference between a man who gets through hard times and a man who doesn't is usually whether he can find what he needs fast." She paused. "He was right about most things." "Sounds like he was," Rhett said. Maggie looked at the cellar for a moment with an expression that was briefly, quietly raw before she put it away. "He'd have liked you," she said. "He liked people who didn't need to be the smartest person in the room all the time." She looked at Rhett with the gray eyes that were so completely her mother's. "Victor Harlan always needs to be the smartest person in the room." "How did you know that?" Rhett asked. "Did you meet him?" "Once," she said, "when I was 9. He came to the house to talk to my mother after my dad was buried. He was very polite, and he smiled a lot, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought he was the most frightening person I had ever met. I didn't know why then. I just knew it." She looked at Rhett again. "Mama knew it too. I could see it in the way she held herself when he was in the room." Rhett thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Eleanor came back on the 5th day, 1 day later than planned, and she came back different. Not different in any way that announced itself, but different in the particular way of people who have been through something that has shifted the ground under them and come out the other side with a different relationship to the weight they've been carrying. She was thin with tiredness. She had circles under her eyes, and she had the slightly frayed look of someone who had spent several days in concentrated and difficult work. But she was straight in the way she sat on the wagon seat, and her eyes when she stepped down were clear. The children came out, and she held them. Charlie first, because he reached her first, and then Maggie, and then Thomas, who submitted to the embrace with the same slightly stiff dignity and the same underlying need. When she looked up at Rhett over Thomas's shoulder, she said simply, "Freer is filing the counter petition this week. He has Colbert's statement and Beatrice's statement and Daniel's documents formally entered into record. He thinks the competency petition will be dismissed within 30 days. She paused. "And the fraud case? Alderton has agreed to hear it. It's on the docket for 3 weeks from the circuit hearing." "That's good," Rhett said.
"It's very good," she said. "It's the best we could have hoped for." She looked at him with something in her face that he was only beginning to learn to read. A fullness, a weight of feeling that she distributed carefully because she had learned not to spend it all at once. "Freer told me something." "What?"
"He said that Victor Harlan has had 3 lawyers approach him in the last 10 days, separately, each one saying the same thing in different words." She paused. "That Harlan wants to settle, quietly, make the legal matters go away and offer me a financial arrangement in exchange for withdrawing my cooperation with the fraud case." Rhett was still for a moment. "What did Freer tell them?" "What I told him to tell them," she said. "No." He looked at her. The evening light was behind her, the long gold of it, and she was standing in his yard with her children around her and her chin level and her voice steady, and she had just turned down what was probably enough money to solve every material problem she had for the next 5 years. "You're sure?" he said. "Not a challenge, just making certain." "He will do this to someone else," she said. "If I take his money and go away, he will find someone else and do this to them. I know it as surely as I know anything." She looked at Rhett directly. "I'm done running. I said that on the porch 3 weeks ago, and I mean it every bit as much now." "I know you do," Rhett said. She put her hand on Charlie's head, turned him gently toward the house. "Come on," she said to the children. "Let's eat something. I've been on the road all day and I'm hungry, and I imagine you've all been waiting to tell me everything Rhett did wrong while I was gone." "He put the wrong grain in the left bin," Thomas said immediately. "I did not," Rhett said. "You did," Thomas said with perfect equanimity. "I fixed it." Eleanor looked at Rhett with a look that was almost a smile. She went inside. Rhett stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the house with its lit windows and its smoke and its sounds of a family returning to itself. He had been here when they were gone, and the house had been fine. He had managed, and the children had managed, and everything that needed doing had gotten done. But he had noticed, quietly and without making a point of it, the difference, the particular way the house was fuller when she was in it. Not louder, just fuller, more itself. He had noticed that. He was still deciding what to do with it. The hearing came, and then the circuit court date, and the 30 days that Freer had estimated became 34, which Rhett felt in his bones in the particular way of waiting for something that matters. The letter came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by the post from town. Eleanor took it from Rhett's hand and opened it at the kitchen table with the same deliberateness with which she did everything. Thomas watching from the doorway, Maggie at the stove, Charlie absorbed in something on the floor. She read it through once. Then she set it down. "The competency petition has been dismissed," she said. Her voice was level. "With prejudice, which means he can't refile it." She looked at the letter. "The fraud case is proceeding. Freer says 2 of Harlan's business associates have now given statements to the court. He says the judge's preliminary assessment is, he used the phrase, not favorable to the defendant." She stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Maggie, from the stove, said quietly, "Is it over?" "Not completely," Eleanor said. "The fraud case still has to run its course. Victor is still—" She stopped. "He still exists. He still has resources and lawyers and anger." She paused. "But the thing he used against me, the children,
The threat of taking the children, that's gone. The court has said so. She looked at Maggie. That part is over.
Maggie turned back to the stove and stirred something and didn't turn around again, but her shoulders, which had been at a particular height for 4 months, came down half an inch. Thomas said nothing. He nodded once, the precise nod of a person who has received information they were prepared for and are filing correctly, and went back outside. Charlie looked up from the floor. "Is the bad man gone?" he asked. "He's being handled," Eleanor said. Charlie looked at this answer from several angles. "Is that the same as gone?" "It's better," Eleanor said. "Gone means he could come back. Being handled means other people are making sure he can't." Charlie considered this and apparently found it satisfactory, and went back to whatever he was doing on the floor. Eleanor looked at Rhett. She had been looking at the letter, and now she looked at him, and everything that was in her face in that moment was the sum of 3 years of running and 3 months of staying still and 4 days in Albuquerque going through her husband's handwriting with a lawyer she'd had to decide to trust, and 1 turned-down settlement offer and 34 days of waiting. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful that words would do that wasn't already being done by the two of them just sitting at the same table in the same kitchen in the same house. After a moment, Eleanor looked back down at the letter. She folded it along its original creases and put it in the pocket of her apron. She got up and went to where Maggie was at the stove and stood beside her and said something quiet that Rhett didn't catch. And Maggie handed her the spoon, and she stirred and they stood together, and neither of them was crying, and neither of them needed to be. That evening, after supper, Rhett walked the perimeter of his land the way he sometimes did at the end of a long day. Not checking anything specific, just walking it the way you walk a thing you're grateful to own, the way his father had walked it, and probably his father before him. The sun was going down over the western ridge, and the sky was the color it got at that particular hour, something between orange and red that the photographs never got right. He thought about Clara. He thought about her in the way he had been thinking about her recently. Not with the usual low ache, but with something that was, he realized, closer to gratitude. Gratitude that she had been here, that she had made this place what it was, that her garden was growing again under someone else's hands, and that she had loved this land enough to plant things in it that would outlast her by years. He thought about Eleanor Pierce, who had arrived at his gate 8 weeks ago with a wobble-wheeled wagon and 3 children and a tin box full of her dead husband's careful handwriting, and who had not, it turned out, been simply running away from something. She had been running toward something. She just hadn't known yet what it was. He came back to the house as the last light was leaving the sky. The kitchen window was lit, and through it he could see Eleanor moving, and the shapes of the children, and all of it was ordinary and alive and his in the way that things become yours, not through ownership but through care. He went inside. Victor Harlan was arrested on a Friday morning in late October, 6 weeks after the circuit court convened to hear the fraud case. Freer sent a wire. It arrived at the post office in town, and Calvin wrote it out himself, which told Rhett something about what it said before he'd even opened it. The sheriff handed it over on the porch without ceremony and stood back while Rhett read it, and then Rhett handed it to Eleanor, who was standing in the doorway because she had heard the horse and come to see. She read it twice. The wire said, "Harlan indicted on 2 counts land fraud, 1 count coercion, 1 count obstruction. Taken into custody this morning, Santa Fe. Bail denied pending flight risk assessment. Case proceeds. More to follow." Freer. Eleanor lowered the paper. She looked at Calvin. She looked at Rhett. She looked back at the paper as if verifying that the words were still there and still said what they said. "It's done," Calvin said quietly. "Not entirely," Eleanor said, which was the kind of thing she would say, accurate, careful, not willing to claim more than was true. "The trial still has to happen. He still has lawyers." "He does," Calvin agreed. "But he's in custody, and the evidence is entered, and Colbert and Beatrice Okafor have both given sworn testimony. Freer says the judge has characterized the evidence as substantial." He paused. "Men like Harlan, when the legal wall goes up solid enough, their lawyers start talking about plea arrangements. It's less embarrassing than a full trial." Eleanor looked at the wire again. Her thumb moved over the paper, a small gesture, barely there, like she was feeling the words rather than reading them. 3 years, she said, to no one in particular, just noting it, just putting it somewhere it could sit.
Yes, Calvin said. She handed the wire back to Rhett and went inside. He heard her speaking to the children, the low tone of it, not the words. And then he heard Maggie say something sharp and surprised, and then quiet. Calvin watched the door. She all right? She will be, Rhett said. Give her a minute. They stood on the porch in the October air, which had finally broken from the summer heat and come in cool from the north, the way it did when the season turned. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, and the light in the afternoons was lower and longer, cutting across the land at an angle that made everything look considered, deliberate. What happens to him? Rhett asked. If it goes to trial, and the evidence holds, and Freer thinks it will, he's looking at prison time. The fraud charges alone carry significant penalties in this territory. The coercion charge adds weight. Calvin turned his hat in his hands, the habit Rhett knew well. He'll lose the land holdings that were acquired through fraud. The court can order restitution to the families he defrauded. He paused. The reach he had, the relationships with other officials, the capacity to make things disappear. That's gone once he's indicted. People don't stay loyal to a man who can't protect them from exposure. His lawyers will negotiate, Rhett said. Almost certainly. A plea means less spectacle, less discovery, less of his other business practices getting aired in open court. Calvin looked out at the land. Either way, he won't be in a position to threaten anyone for a very long time. Rhett nodded. He looked at his land. The garden bed's gone dormant now for the season, but the soil turned and tended and ready for spring, the barn solid, the paddock fence repaired and straight, the house with its lit window and its smoke and its sounds. Thank you, Calvin, he said, for all of it. Calvin put his hat on. That's what I'm here for, he said, in the tone of a man who means it plainly and doesn't need it elaborated. He mounted up and rode back toward town. Inside the house, Charlie was crying again. Not from fear this time. Rhett could hear the difference. The way the pitch of it was different, less afraid and more overwhelmed. The kind of crying that happens when something that has been pressing on a small person for a long time is suddenly lifted. Eleanor's voice underneath it, steady and low. Maggie saying something to Thomas that Rhett couldn't catch. He sat on the porch steps and gave them their time. The hardest part of being the person who stands outside is knowing when staying outside is the right thing. Rhett had learned this slowly through the particular education of the last several months, which had taught him things about himself that he hadn't been looking to learn, and which he was, on balance, grateful for, even when they were uncomfortable. He had learned that he was capable of more than he'd been doing with himself, that the specific self-contained sufficiency he'd built around his grief was not the same as strength, though it had felt like it, that a house with people in it was not the same as a house with less quiet, but a house with more of everything that made quiet worth returning to. Clara had known this about him, probably. She had been, as Maggie would have said, right about most things. He sat until the sounds inside settled. Then he went in. Eleanor was at the kitchen table. The children were in the back. He could hear them, a low murmur, the sound of them processing together in the way they did. The tight, small unit they had been for 3 years and were still, even now, even here. Eleanor had the wire on the table in front of her and a cup of something hot beside it that she hadn't touched yet. She looked up when he came in. Her face was different, not dramatically. Eleanor Pierce's face was never dramatic. It was always doing that work of management and presentation, the face of someone who had learned to give away only what she chose to give. But underneath the management, there was something he hadn't seen there before, or hadn't seen in this particular form, a kind of settling. Like a long-braced thing had finally been allowed to rest. Maggie asked if we could have something special for supper, Eleanor said, to mark it. What did you tell her? I told her yes. A pause. I don't know what we have. I'll go look, Rhett said. He went to the root cellar, which was organized in Maggie's system now and easy to navigate, and he found what they needed and he brought it back and handed it over. And Eleanor and Maggie cooked together that evening while Rhett and Thomas saw to the animals and Charlie provided ongoing commentary on everything and no one asked him to stop. Supper that night was the most ordinary, extraordinary thing Rhett could remember. The food was good and there was enough of it, and the kitchen was warm, and the 5 of them were at the table, and the conversation went in 3 directions at once, and nobody was watching the road. That was the thing he noticed. Nobody was watching the road.
For the first time since Eleanor Pierce had arrived at his gate with her wobble-wheeled wagon and her gray eyes and her 3 children and her tin box full of her husband's careful handwriting, the space around the supper table was not also occupied by the waiting, by the listening, by the low-frequency vigilance that he had noticed in her and in Thomas. And he now realized in Maggie too. Even Maggie, 12 years old and controlled, had been listening at a frequency below the surface of everything she did. Not tonight. Tonight they were just eating supper. It was not a perfect evening. Charlie knocked over his cup and cried briefly about it and then stopped. Thomas and Maggie had a small, sharp disagreement about something that was resolved by Eleanor saying 3 words in a tone that closed the matter, and both of them went back to eating with the slightly aggrieved dignity of siblings who know they've been fairly managed. The cornbread was a little dry. Maggie admitted this herself, critically, already calculating what she'd do differently. It was imperfect in all the ways that real things are imperfect, and it was the best supper Rhett Calloway had eaten in 3 years, and he sat at the head of his table and knew it while it was happening, which was not something he had always been good at. In the weeks that followed, the formal pieces moved the way legal things move, slower than urgency demanded and faster than despair expected. Freer sent letters at regular intervals. Harlan's lawyers did negotiate, as Calvin had predicted. The plea arrangement, when it was finalized in December, resulted in a guilty finding on the fraud charges, a suspended sentence on the coercion charge contingent on a permanent restraining order that barred any contact with Eleanor or her children, and the ordered return of the fraudulently acquired land to the Colbert family and the estate of the late Henderson family. His business holdings were diminished. His influence in the county evaporated with the efficiency of things built on compliance rather than loyalty. Freer's final letter arrived just before Christmas. It was short, which was Freer's way of saying everything necessary had been said and the rest was lived rather than documented. The matter is concluded, Mrs. Pierce. You are free. Freer. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and folded it and put it in the tin box with Daniel's papers and the 2 letters that had helped undo Victor Harlan. She locked the box and put it back in the wardrobe. Then she went out to the garden, which was sleeping under the winter ground, and stood in it for a while. Rhett found her there. He didn't say anything for a moment. The December air was cold and the sky was the flat white of a day considering snow, and Eleanor was standing among the dormant beds with her arms at her sides and her face turned slightly up, the way people do when they're trying to feel something through their skin rather than their mind. He pled guilty, she said, without turning. Freer told me, Rhett said. He had gotten the same letter, a brief note acknowledging the conclusion and thanking him for his cooperation. It's done. It's done, she said. She looked at the garden. I keep waiting to feel something specific, something that announces itself clearly, like relief should feel like something I recognize. What does it feel like? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Like setting down something very heavy, she said, and then not knowing what to do with your hands. He looked at the bare garden, the turned earth, the stakes still in the ground from the tomatoes that had finished in September. Spring will come, he said. You'll find something to do with your hands. She turned and looked at him. There was a directness in it that was different from her usual directness, which was always purposeful, always aimed at something specific. This was just looking, just seeing. I want to stay, she said. He held her gaze. I know. I mean, she stopped. She was not, he had learned, a woman who struggled for words often. When she stopped, it was because she was being careful, choosing accurately. Not as an arrangement, she said. Not as, I work here and my children are fed. I mean, she looked at the house, looked back at him. I mean, I want this to be home. Actually, home. For all of us. She paused. If that is something you want. Rhett looked at her. He thought about all the ways he might answer that. All the careful framings and the qualifications and the slow, cautious language of a man who had spent 3 years deciding that less was safer than more. He thought about what it had cost him, that caution, what it had given him too, but what it had cost. It is, he said. It's been home for a while now. I just wasn't sure you'd decided that yet. Eleanor's mouth moved. Not a full smile. She was not a woman who smiled easily or fully,
and he had stopped expecting her to be. And the partial thing that her mouth did was so entirely hers that he wouldn't have traded it for anyone else's full one. "I decided a while ago," she said. "I was deciding whether to say it." "Why did you decide to say it today?"
She looked at the winter garden. "Because I'm done waiting for things to be certain before I do them," she said. "I spent 3 years waiting to be safe enough. There's no such thing as safe enough. There's just now, and what you do with it." Rhett nodded slowly. He had lived long enough and lost enough to know she was right about that in the particular way that things are right when they cost something to know. "Then stay," he said. "Simply. The way you say the thing that is both smaller and larger than what you feel." She looked at him, and for a moment the careful management she kept over her face was simply not there. Not because she had lowered it, but because she didn't need it, which was a different thing entirely. And in that moment he saw just Eleanor Pierce, tired and brave and imperfect and alive, standing in a winter garden in New Mexico, deciding to stop running. He asked her to marry him in February. Not romantically, or not in any way that would have satisfied a romance novel, which was fine, because neither of them were interested in romance novels. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, the children in their room, the house in its evening quiet, and Rhett said what he had been thinking since December in the direct, plain way he did most things. "I'd like to make this official," he said, "if you would." Eleanor looked up from the mending she was doing. "Official," she said. "Married," he said. She set down the mending. She looked at him for a long moment with those gray eyes that were always seeing more than they showed. And he waited, because she was the kind of person who needed to actually decide, not the kind who said yes automatically to avoid the discomfort of the pause. "Yes," she said, finally. "All right," he said. "That's it?" she said. "All right. What would you like me to say?" She picked up her mending again. The corner of her mouth moved. "Nothing," she said. "All right is fine." They were married in March, in the sheriff's office because it was the appropriate venue, and also because Calvin would have been insulted not to be the first to know, by a justice of the peace who did it in 10 minutes and shook both their hands after. Maggie had made a point of doing her hair for it, which was unusual, and stood with the expression of someone observing a significant event and processing its implications seriously. Thomas shook Rhett's hand, which he did with the same gravity he brought to handshakes generally, but held it a moment longer than usual. Charlie wore his hat, the oversized one that still fell slightly forward on his head, and informed the justice of the peace that Rhett was his person and had been for a long time already. The justice of the peace, who was 60 years old and had seen many things, said, "Is that right?" "Yes," Charlie said, with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who knows an obvious truth when he sees one. The years that followed were not simple. Nothing in New Mexico was simple, and nothing about 5 people building a life together from pieces of other lives was simple. And anyone who tried to tell it as though it was would be lying in the particular way of people who mistake the outcome for the journey. Rhett and Eleanor had disagreements, real ones, not the managed negotiations of 2 people being careful with each other, but the genuine friction of 2 strong-willed people who saw things differently and said so. She thought he was too slow to ask for help when he needed it. He thought she was too quick to shoulder things alone. They were both right. They both kept being right about each other's flaws for 31 years, and they got better at it slowly and imperfectly, which is exactly how people get better at things that actually matter. Thomas grew into a man who was spare with words and generous with action, and who took over the East Pasture operations by the time he was 17 with a competence that made Rhett feel something that was adjacent to pride but was warmer. He stayed on the ranch. He married a woman from a neighboring property who was as capable and as quiet as he was, and they were therefore very efficient together, and they had 4 children who were loud in ways that Thomas bore with patient bewilderment. Maggie left at 19. She had always been going to leave, so they all knew it, even Maggie herself, in the way that some people are built for a particular kind of life, and some are built for something that requires more room than any one place can provide. She went to Albuquerque first, then further. She studied law, which surprised no one who had watched her manage the household accounts at 12. She became the kind of lawyer who was not bought, which was a direct inheritance from a father who had kept careful records, and a mother who had refused a settlement, and a man named Freer who had modeled what that looked like in practice. She wrote letters.
She came home at Christmas most years and was brisk about it in a way that made the visit feel like a gift given freely rather than a duty performed.
Charlie grew up the way some people do, without apparent effort, as if the becoming was just what happened when you left him alone to be himself. He was easy and curious and loyal in ways that cost him things sometimes, which he never seemed to mind. He worked the ranch into his 20s and then went west, to California, drawn by something he couldn't fully explain and didn't try to. He came back for summers and wrote long meandering letters in between that arrived out of order and made Eleanor laugh the way she had laughed that one evening in the kitchen, briefly catching her off guard, entirely real. The garden was Eleanor's for 30 years. She worked it every spring and managed it every summer and put it to rest every fall, with the same methodical patience she had brought to it on her knees, pulling beetles out of the bean rows in the first weeks. It was never the same 2 years running. She tried different things, moved plants, experimented with what the soil would hold, lost crops to drought and cold and things she didn't anticipate, started again. This was, Rhett thought, entirely characteristic of her. She did not expect things to stay the way she had arranged them. She just kept tending. She was not easy to live with, which she would have told you herself without embarrassment. She was exacting and sometimes impatient, and she had a particular expression she made when she thought someone was being inefficient that was difficult to be on the receiving end of. She held things tightly. She had learned over years to hold some things less tightly, and the learning was visible in the way that learning is visible in people who are doing it genuinely, imperfectly, with visible effort, with occasional backsliding. She was the person Rhett told things to. He had not had that, not completely, not even with Clara, who had been the love of the earlier part of his life, in the way that some loves are shaped by the people you are when they happen rather than the people you become. Eleanor knew him as the person he was after grief, which was a different person, and she had never asked him to be the before version, and that was its own kind of gift. Clara's garden grew tomatoes and beans and squash under Eleanor's hands, and under the hands of Thomas's children, and eventually the hands of their children. And the garden did not remember who had first planted it any more than the land remembered who had first walked it. It just grew. That was what it did. On an evening in the autumn of their 22nd year together, Rhett and Eleanor sat on the porch in the old way. The 2 chairs, the coffee, the land going gold in the late light. And Eleanor said, without any particular preamble, which was her way, "I've been thinking about the day I drove up this road." "What about it?" "I was trying to calculate exactly how desperate I was," she said. "Whether I was more afraid of you or more afraid of everything else." She looked at the road. "You came out to the porch, and you stood there, and you were very large and very unsmiling, and you looked at my wagon and my children, and I thought, he's going to send us on." "I almost did," Rhett said. "What stopped you?" He thought about it. "Charlie was asleep in the wagon," he said. "I looked at him and I thought..." He stopped. "I thought nobody should have to move a sleeping child unless they have to." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "That's what saved us," she said. "A sleeping child. That, and you told me you weren't delicate and you weren't slow and you didn't complain about the work." "That was a fairly accurate self-assessment," she said. "It was," he agreed. "Though you do complain about the work sometimes." "When the work deserves it," she said, which was also accurate. The land in front of them was the land it had always been. The scrub and the ridge and the road and the wide New Mexico sky that did things with light that never repeated exactly. Rhett had lived on this land for 41 years before Eleanor arrived, and he had lived on it with her for 22 years after, and the 2 periods of it were both his and were not in competition. That was something it had taken him a long time to understand, and that he understood now with a completeness that had no anxiety in it. "Did you think it would be this?" Eleanor asked. "When you told me to bring the wagon around, did you think—" "No," he said. "I thought you needed a place to stay. I thought you'd be gone in a month." "I thought so too," she said. "But you said yet," he said, "on the porch that first month. I asked if you could tell me about it, and you said you couldn't. Not yet." She turned to look at him. "You remembered that." "I remembered that," he said. She looked at the road again. "I didn't know I was going to stay," she said. "I don't think I decided it consciously. I think I just stopped leaving. And then it became true before I'd named it." That, Rhett thought, was how most true things worked. You didn't decide them. You just lived in a certain direction long enough that the decision was made without you, in the accumulation of days, in the meals, and the fence posts, and the garden, and the supper table, and the small weight of a child who had decided you were his person. You stopped leaving, and then you had stayed. There are things that people call luck when they don't know what else to call them. A woman who turned onto a ranch road because she had nowhere else to go. A man who looked at a sleeping 6-year-old in a wagon and couldn't bring himself to say the words that would have moved him along. A tin box full of a dead man's careful handwriting. A neighbor woman in Taos who had once been told to stay out of things that weren't her concern and who had decided 3 years later that they were. None of it was planned. None of it was clean. The grief was real, and the danger was real, and the fear was real, and the loneliness was real, and the imperfection of two difficult people building something together was real every single day for 31 years. But so was the garden every spring. So was the supper table. So was the sound of the house at night, when everyone was in it and the land was quiet outside, and the particular warmth of a place that had been lived in fully, not preserved or protected, but actually inhabited, day after day, season after season, until the walls themselves seemed to hold the accumulated weight of it. What Rhett Calloway learned in the long years after a desperate widow drove up his road and changed the direction of his life without either of them knowing that was what was happening, was this. Love is not the thing that saves you. It is the thing you build after you have saved yourself. It is what happens in the space that courage makes. Eleanor Pierce had been brave enough to stop running. He had been brave enough to open a gate. The rest of it, the family and the years and the legacy and the laughter in the rooms where there had only been silence, was what two imperfect people made when they decided, without ceremony, without certainty, without any guarantee at all, to stay. The porch light came on behind them. Maggie was visiting for the week and she was in the kitchen doing something efficient with the supper, and Thomas's youngest had gotten into the barn again and Thomas was going to get her, and from somewhere inside the house, Charlie's voice carried out through the open window, telling some story to whoever would listen, the same as he always had, the same as he always would. The road was empty and the sky was wide and the land went on as it always had, indifferent and enduring, holding whoever was willing to put down roots in it. Rhett Calloway reached over without looking and took his wife's hand, and Eleanor Pierce, who had spent 3 years running and 31 years staying, turned her palm up and held on. That was all. That was everything. That was enough.